call this work session to order. And Kirsten, can you call roll?
Yep. Chair Allen?
Here.
Ms. Simpson?
Here.
Mr. Carey?
Here.
Ms. Walker?
Here.
Mr. Russell? Mr. Griffin?
Here.
And Mr. Clifford and Mr. Kupfer are absent.
All right, thanks very much. So tonight's a work session. We're starting a little early. I know this one is, although we don't ordinarily with work sessions, given the nature of the topic, we're going to do the usual video and audio recording, and this one will end up on cable access. Because of the early start, I got a little bit of pizza here, and we're grabbing a quick dinner while we get started on our work. Julia, you want to, or Brad, Julia, you want to talk a little bit about what we want to try to accomplish tonight, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the conversation we had last week about how to think about some of this work.
Why, sure. Tonight's meeting, we're basically continuing the discussion of the May 28th meeting, which, just as an aside, hopefully you noticed that I was not there. I did watch parts of it last night at home at my spare time, and I noticed that some of you were very difficult to hear, so just be aware, and actually these guys were very, very difficult to hear, so just kind of be aware that to talk clearly into your mic. But we're going to review the feedback that was heard both at the meeting but also over the surveys, discuss changes to the plan and approach based on that feedback. I'm hoping to really have a real in-depth discussion of the vision and policies and strategies, and then maybe talk a little bit more about the action items and maybe not moving those forward, but we'll talk about that. I'm hoping to get direction for additional changes before we send out notices for public hearings. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on the slide, but basically the process in planning for this type for the public is that we send out notice to DLCD agencies as well as the public. The DLCD notice is required to be 35 days before you hold a hearing, and so we want to get that, yeah, this is okay to do the notice. And then we'll still hold public hearings. Changes can still happen after that point at the Planning Commission level as well as at the council level. I was talking with Commissioner Mrs. Miss Simpson, and just reminded, and some of you guys weren't here for the Brookman concept plan, but if you recall at that point, we did our notice, and I think there was a series of several work sessions, several hearings, where changes were made to that plan before you ever forwarded it on to the city council, and then the city council made additional changes to the plan. So just because we have something that we move forward to the next step in public notice, it doesn't mean that there can't be additional changes. So I just want to stress that. So that's my hope for this evening, and talk about why we're doing a plan and that kind of thing.
So I guess the only thing I would add to that, we've had some kind of back and forth here last time and then at the work session with the council about how to consider this stuff. And it's, on the one hand, focus on the vision, policies, and strategies because that's really what we want to accomplish, versus focus on the tasks because that's a draft that we sit right now of what we would do to accomplish those vision, policies, and strategies. And on the one hand, how do you know whether you like the policies and strategies if you don't know what the tasks are that would go with them? If you don't like particular tasks, how does that inform the strategies? And what Julie and I talked about maybe was trying to, as we start to discuss those, look at them as a set, kind of policies and strategies and tasks together, so that you can kind of have that be circular is not the right word, but have that discussion, look at both those perspectives, so that we're really talking about what is it we want to get accomplished and what are some tools that would, that we would use to get that accomplished. But we can also have the conversation to say, if we don't like those tools and there are no other tools that we can think of, then maybe what that really means is we don't like that policy or strategy. Does that make sense as kind of a thought process?
So when you say strategy, you mean the action items?
No, strategies are above the action items.
Okay.
And that's the idea, is not to get too fixated on strategy, on action items, without having them attached to the strategies, so that we know whether it's the strategy or the action that we don't like, or do like, or whatever.
And the PowerPoint is really more of a roll up your sleeves and work process. So I think we'll, as I move forward, I think that will be clear, hopefully. So
Okay.
I also wanted to point out that Darcy Rudzinski, I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name right, with Angelo Planning, she's the lead consultant that's been working with us, and then Chris Majeski is here. So when we get into the weeds, they'll be able to help you identify, well, that's really important, or yeah, that could be changed. And then Chris, obviously with the transportation elements, will be able to answer that as well.
And then the last thing, I guess, just from a format standpoint, last time was a work session, and we sort of made an exception and agreed to go ahead and take public testimony because there was a lot of public interest. Tonight, we're going to revert back to our ordinary work session process of this is going to be a discussion between staff and the Planning Commission. But as Julia pointed out, whatever might come from this will go through extensive public hearing processes. So there will still be lots of opportunity to take testimony and hear from the public.
Yeah.
So let's dive in.
So the first is, why are we doing a town center plan? Just as a reminder, Michelle, I think, mentioned at the last meeting that Metro had their 2040 growth concept that identified that there's going to be regional centers and town centers throughout the Portland metro area. We had a designated town center, but no plan. And having a plan helps communicate the community's vision and helps focus investment and energy. It also helps by identifying what we want. We're also able to say what we don't want. It helps really protect that place that you want to hold as the heart of your community. And so basically it's telling existing and future residences and businesses what we want. And then also we received a grant. So there are some strings attached that we have to kind of meet some milestones, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we go along, because while we do have a grant, there is some flexibility there too. And I guess I'll mention that now. One thing, when I was talking with Jean, there seemed to be a perception that we had to have something to move forward by June, by the end of this month. And that would certainly be ideal, and I'm hoping that we are able to move some information forward for noticing, but we don't have to be done with this process by June. We have to be done with the grant work by June, and so there are some, staff will be spending more staff time, and we won't get reimbursed for that, but we're still committed to moving that forward. So I just wanted to make that clear if there was any misunderstanding that we had to be done by the end of this month. We recognize that there's a process and it's iterative, and that we will continue.
And there'll be no more consultants after the end of June?
For the most part, and Darcy, the consultant hours have to be billed by the end of June. They have indicated they will still support us, but they're not going to be able to support us in the same way that they've supported us through this grant process. So we won't have the ability to really reevaluate from a start over standpoint.
But could we estimate another X number of hours to be used in August when we go to hearings?
Not with the grant money. I mean, that's something that we certainly may have to think about doing with city funds, but the grant will not allow any
Pre-billing?
carryover.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so. That's a good question.
State grants have to be, the work has to be done
Right.
before the end of the
Right, and so
period.
we're meeting the milestones that we need to meet,
So-
except for the adoption.
So if we have a vision or an idea or something, I think we need to study this. We need to know now so that it can be
Right.
completed prior to June 30th.
Right.
Okay.
Just if we can stop here on this, why are we doing the plan for a second? Because I think this is maybe part of what a lot of this recent couple of months has helped clarify in my thinking. If I just casually read this, a really simple version of this is we're doing this because various people are telling us we have to or paying us to do it, right? Which really kind of sounds externally directed, and that may be true, that may have been true, or that may be true going back to the functional plan in 2040 and all that stuff. Seems to me that my reason for wanting to do it is the area we're talking about is completely developable and zoned, and stuff can get built there, and we can kind of predict what will get built there based on what our code says you can do. And if we think that's cool, and that's all we want to have out there is what the current zoning and design standards and incentives and all those things allow for, then I'm not sure then the discussion I'd want to have is, do we even need a town center plan? If we think that what can get built out there now maybe is different than what the community really wants, and that's where things like the survey and public testimony and things like that to me are really helpful, that's to me the reason to do this town center plan is to have something different out there than what would happen otherwise, which pretty much is more of the same. Thinking about the Six Corners element is a little bit different with the neighborhood section and the Old Town section, but for sure at Six Corners, if the reason to do this is because we want to have something different happen, and I'm not sure this really captures that notion. It really feels like it's externally driven, which I don't think is completely true.
So
Yeah, Gene.
if the consequence of not adopting the metro plan is that we are no longer in line for regional transportation funding because we don't have a town center plan that identifies that, is that a consequence that we as a commission and ultimately the council would be willing to accept, to say if we don't want to adopt a town center plan different than what we have right now, how does it impact our funding, and are we willing to accept that?
Well, if it were me, the way I'd want to have that conversation is to say, what does this plan have us do and say we want to have out there? And if at the end of that discussion is, no, we don't like any of that stuff, we think what will happen out there is okay, then that's the next conversation to have, is to say, well, all right, then what? If that's where I'm not sure that's where we'll actually get.
So when I read through this, like the second bullet, Sherwood has a designated town center, but no plan. Metro determined it was designated this as a town center in Sherwood. And do we have a choice about that?
Metro identified a purple circle at generally the Six Corners intersection, and said, this is where your town center is. You define the boundaries and you define the plan, for lack of more details. I know that there are jurisdictions, I'm not going to get my details accurate, but I believe Milwaukee had a regional center and downgraded it, was able to work with Metro to get it down to a town center. So there is some flexibility. I don't know that anybody has flat out said we don't want any part of it, and that got.
Yeah, this isn't like the purple dot on the Metro map landed from a spaceship on the map and on the community. There was dialogue at the time with the leadership in the community at the time of is there a town center, where should it be? There was discussion at the time that I recall, although I wasn't involved in planning commission, about was it Old Town or was it Six Corners, and that was the community's leadership preference at the time was at Six Corners. So I don't think we should look at this as something utterly foreignly imposed on us.
And the thing I guess that I want to stress is that we have a town center and we have an old town area that we love, but we don't have a plan that for our town center, and so it's really just kind of reconciling, I guess, what's there and the fact that we have no plan, and are the boundaries that were determined, back in the late 90s, is that really where our town center is? And based on the feedback that we got early on in the process from the stakeholders and the stakeholder advisory committee and the public at open houses, was that the Six Corners area is not where we feel like our town center is. So
It grew and morphed into
Right,
the three
right.
sections.
And
So
I
far.
know, and I know that I overheard Russell say that he needed to leave, and I know I talked with Jean a little bit before the meeting, and she has a lot of questions about why the boundary was selected the way it was, and she wanted to hear from someone that was on the stakeholder advisory committee, and we'll be here to kind of support you, but I wanted to make sure you have a chance to chime in. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is the study area. Again, I think that you got this update at the last meeting, but we initially looked at a very large area. The dashed gray line area is where our current town center boundary is, and the question was, should it be there? The feedback that we heard was that no matter anything else, Old Town should be part of our town center. And so we did the three alternatives where we looked at just Old Town, we looked at the whole study area, and then we looked at this edges concept. And based on the different alternatives and the feedback, the edges concept is what rose to the surface. Russell, can you chime in as to? I've explained to Jean, and partly because she's kind of coming in late in the process and doesn't necessarily.
It's hard for the newcomers.
It is.
I think Julia explained that rather well, because I think there were a few people that said it should be Old Town no matter what. But there were more people who said, well, we don't necessarily want Old Town to become something other than what it kind of is already. So we don't want to put a target on it, a bullseye. So maybe Old Town could be part of the project or the plan, but let's make it a part of it, but let's not make it the focus of it.
So my question most pointedly would be, if you had been given the opportunity to say, we have 2 town center districts, one's called Old Town and the other is called Six Corners, would you have pursued making 2 town center designations that cross the highway? Because I see a disparity of applying a set of town center standards on one side of the highway, south of 12th and Sherwood Road, and not encompassing the Six Corner area. And I don't understand why the stakeholder committee didn't see value in having the whole area develop cohesively, understanding that they're 2 distinct areas. They would have 2 sets of goals and policies unique to their characteristics, but why wouldn't you cross the highway?
I think it was felt that even though, everything north is legitimately part of the city, most of the hubbub in terms of congregational sites, where people gather and to do their stuff, tend to happen south of the freeway. And I don't think that anybody really thought, for any length of time, that there was any. I think the majority of people said we didn't want a highway running straight through the heart of our town center, because we probably won't, although Darcy, she's a visionary, and we've talked about this. It would be delightful if we could get ODOT to pay for narrowing down Highway 99 to 2 roads and putting in palm trees and bridges over the top. She didn't quite say all that stuff, but I think the committee pretty quickly said, we don't know if we can do that. So we're going to keep it on the south side instead of having a highway run right through the middle of our town center. And then there was also, the magnetic pull of having Old Town even further south of that. So that kind of pulled the whole thing down.
And did the stakeholder advisory committee understand the potential impact of what code language would look like if you're applying it to both areas the same way? That the strategies and goals would be applied to the same area? When I look at these, they look very much, if you apply them to one, it works, or it doesn't work to the other. And there's a couple policies like, make gateways that work all throughout, but some of these policies work well for one area, but not the other.
Right. Yeah. So I think that, they are slightly different areas, physically different areas, north and south. Not that one is better than the other. They're just different.
Absolutely
They're just different. So I don't think the committee felt that there was going to be any big disadvantage to having a different set. It's kind of like the Old Town overlay. It's unique to Old Town. So I'm thinking the committee was thinking that the proposed plan would be unique to whatever we decide the town center is. And there's no reason why we can't pull elements of that plan out and incorporate that into future, plans code that we do in other areas of the city. But it was pretty unanimous not to have it go north of the highway.
So are we talking about north of 99, north of 12 and Sherwood, both differently?
Even though everybody knew something was coming to the property where Walmart is intending to build, even though everybody knew that, they really felt that Langer Parkway driveway, Target Expressway, whatever it's officially called, was kind of a good place, a good boundary.
What about Regal Cinemas?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I was a part of that discussion, but I think that if you include the cinemas, do you sneak out and get Home Depot? Do you?
Oh, no.
It seemed. I think it was kind of maybe a neat and tidy approach.
Because I look at the Six Corners area, and there's a very large vacant parcel on one of those corners, and it is a gateway to our community. It is an opportunity to have it be cohesive with the whole area if we incorporate the plan to be the Six Corners Commercial Town Center.
Northeast of Safeway?
Yes.
Yeah.
And one thing I'll chime in on, and I kind of mentioned this to Jean, but in a different way. That it doesn't mean that we can't have additional area districts or area plans or look at, a north of the highway concept or a north of Tualatin Sherwood Road concept if we wanted to. So I don't know that you're eliminating the ability to do additional planning by designating the boundaries as proposed. That said, I know that there was a lot of discussion about the north of 99. And I'm wondering, Chris or Darcy, if you have any thoughts to add about if it were to cross Tualatin Sherwood Road, I don't remember us really discussing that concept in much detail.
Well, and while she's pondering the answer to that, we did some concept planning of that area about 3 years ago.
We did the Adams Avenue North
Right.
concept plan, but
Right.
it was just the unincorporated area, so it didn't include the Regal Cinemas.
I guess what some of the discussion around Walmart has caused me to think more about than I maybe have before is redevelopment. Whether you think Walmart will have an impact on other large retailers like Albertsons. I know there was some discussion at City Council about their distribution changes and things like that. But certainly when I think about redevelopment potential, the Regal Cinemas development is just on its face the largest block of really underutilized land, given how much space is there for what activity occurs. And it seems like that's an area that this is an effort that could, capture, even though Tualatin Sherwood Road runs through, divides the two sides.
So I have another comment. I thought about this a lot, this last week, and I happened to be in Wilsonville picking up something for my daughter's birthday earlier in the week, last week. And I instead of going, I went the back way, and then instead of taking the second exit to get down to, I was going south near Fry's, going to Fry's. I decided to go into Costco, and I snaked through like you do, and down past Mentor Graphics, and what happened was, and then I take the bump next to the cinema, and further down. Everybody knows where I am now. Down that little road. There's a park on the left. I always loved that park. Great little park. Well, on the right is this place called Park Pavilion. Are you guys familiar with this place? And it's built right against the edge of the street. Kind of. It's a little bit kind of like our U.S. Bank is. How U.S. Bank is, there's like one corner next to the sidewalk and the rest is it's kind of like that. And then I was thinking about how that side, the north side of whatever the main street is that goes through Wilsonville on the second exit.
Wilsonville
Wilsonville.
Is that what that is? Okay. How they have sort of incorporated, pedestrian-friendly things going from the north side to the south side. So on the south side, where the gym is and where the Red Robin is, that area that was, developed a long time ago. So they have kind of a very nice town center. It does go across a big road, like our Tualatin Sherwood Road. I think though they stopped at I-5. I don't believe it goes all the way over, into. I mean, it's nice what they're doing on the other side.
But have you seen the other side, gone past the Fred Meyer and gone down that
Yes.
road to the Boone's Ferry?
Yeah.
It seems
Very
very,
much town centery.
very town centery.
It's definitely a very nice treatment, right? So I don't want to speak for the city of Wilsonville, but I could see some of the. I kind of already did.
Yes.
Sorry, Wilsonville.
Too late.
I love Wilsonville. But I could see definitely some of those kinds of things where the buildings are situated so they have maybe a part of the facade facing the street, and there's more of a pedestrian-friendly walkway where they can, it's only just a few feet of grass that they cross to get to the door to this. I could see that along, Langer Drive, for example, and or, that out in front of Safari Sam's, if that gets kind of redone, that area. Or I could see it even like in the cinema parking lot. It's we kind of have that L-shaped, and we see the back doors of everything, but.
Right.
And that was my perfect example with Julia earlier was
Agree.
we had, I don't know what phase we were in commercial design center. I was on the planning commission when the Regal Cinemas L-shaped building came in. And the criteria was pedestrian access and frontages. However, our code didn't allow us to consider what it looked like to the gateway, and we could not tell the developer at that time that
I disagree with that because I was there too, and we blinked. The developer basically said, if you require that, which
We
he
didn't.
didn't argue, I won't build it. It's too expensive. And we said, okay, build it cheap. Because we talked about windows and customer doors on the street
yeah,
side.
we wanted
And-
stuff on
and
that
the
side.
argument was not that the code didn't require it; it's that he just wouldn't do it.
And I'd argue that the code now
Does
it
it.
requires it.
Right.
And I don't know what the code said back then, but I know that the code now would not allow that development as it is.
How does that go back to our discussion of moving it across 99 or?
Yeah, I
mean,
think we have
understand-
experts to bail us out.
We all, that's more what your conversation about.
Right.
Wilsonville is more the
Right.
development up to the sidewalk.
Yeah,
And
I'm
those
interested.
other issues.
I am personally interested in maybe including the Cinnamon area. I think maybe it would be too difficult to include what's on the other side of 99 in our initial plan. That's my.
Answer.
And Russell, just why did they choose the Langard Parkway Drive to stop there where the Walmart's going? Because that's a big chunk of undeveloped land. It
True.
almost seems
And
reasonable
everybody
to
knew-
incorporate that.
Everybody knew it was going to be developed. Everybody knew Graymore was going to develop it, and so that was discussed several times because of recent Graymore developments, near us within 20 miles. I think they knew it was going to be something nice, acceptable, very nice in the community, and I think that they, because once you get past Tualatin Sherwood Road, or once you get past, get on the other side of that, you're just a stone's throw from Tualatin, and there's nothing quite out. I think they were trying to keep it, kind of condensed down to, and that was again tidy, neat boundary. It was a tidy, neat boundary.
You
Crossing
guys-
Tualatin and Sherwood.
Yeah, so I'll start with the transportation aspect of it and let Darcy pick up on the land use and other components. I think the story all starts back on 99, not Tualatin Sherwood, when we talked about the vision for a town center, a place where you can walk and bike and go from store to store. To do that on 99, we talked about how do you transform that facility into something that is comfortable to have buildings facing, to walk and bike on. And we said to do that, you'd have to narrow it down to 5 lanes instead of the 7-lane road that it is. And we looked at the traffic impacts of that, and it was pretty substantial. We also looked at, if you brought in that land on the north side of the highway, what are the traffic impacts of more density there? And again, bringing in more land mass was pretty substantial traffic impacts. And so that conversation kind of led to, it'd be tough to do without the southern arterial from the I-5-99 connector in place. So let's, instead of trying to overcome the barrier, basically turn your back on the barrier and reorient towards Langer Drive as the walkable, bikeable street. And I think that thought process just carried over to Tualatin Sherwood Road. I don't recall us discussing it in nearly as much detail. But again, a major arterial roadway that's already 5 lanes is going to be widened by the county with their current project that's underway. How do you get people to want to walk and bike across it and have buildings face it and have it be a pleasant place to be? That's what I recall the conversations.
So my question then goes back to the plan. Is the plan meant to satisfy Metro's need to have a town center that designates what's walkable or not, or Sherwood's desire to designate a 6-corner area that has a common theme or place to it? I wouldn't think it would be a bad thing to say we have 2 walkable 6 corners districts on either side of the highway that are a cohesively planned unit. Even though you can't walk from one side to the other as easily as Metro might like, we can look at those 2 areas and say each area distinctively has its own set of walking areas. They can get to the grocery store, they can get back and forth to where they need to go. There's a restaurant over there, just like it is on the other side. So having a 6 corners walkable doesn't mean to me I have to walk across 99 to go from one grocery store to another. It means I can walk from my housing area over to Safeway.
So my question would be, if we build it, will they use it? One of the things that we talked about, at least at one point, I don't know if it was in the meeting or it was after the meeting, that even if we had, a better infrastructure to get people safely across 99, would people use it? Or do people, people who live on this side will always go to Albertsons, people who live on that side will always kind of walk the Safeway and.
But is the
That's
purpose
fine.
to get more transportation or to provide a
Cohesive look.
a cohesive look with the other policies and goals. I'm getting confused as to what our ultimate goal is to get a transportation plan, or is it to get a town center look and feel?
Yeah, is it about the form of development that occurs in whatever area we're talking about, or primarily, or is it primarily about the transportation connections within the area, or is it maybe a little bit of both?
Well,
And
we
I think
haven't-
you raise a really good point about, if you think of the Safeway side of the highway and its connectedness to the neighborhoods that are right around it, it's really the same parallel set of issues with just different neighborhoods.
Right.
And the public was not particularly hot on having a ton of places for more people to walk and to bike. And that wasn't what they were that concerned with. And so I think that what she's talking about is addressing those as two different units within a larger six corners view. If you could make them walkable and bikeable within those two pods, so to speak, I think that would be a better way to look at it, because I would hate to have it just stop right there. We need to have that development on the other corner, and Regal Cinema is involved.
So let me suggest, I think we've kind of given this a good little bit of exposition about what's gone into the boundary so far and what some of the issues might be. I think it might be useful to now set the boundary aside for a little bit and go more into the strategies and actions and spend some time on that, and that might help us loop back around then to what we think the right boundary is to apply those strategies and actions. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great, because I'm getting lost in, are we trying to meet transportation, or are we trying to protect a look and feel of our community?
And I would argue it's both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that and when Patrick talked about the forum, and I know we want to move on from the boundary for a second, but I guess with the highway running in the middle of it, it just feels like you're going to have it's going to be different. You've got a highway through the middle of it. So I don't know that necessarily has to have the same form as you have on the south side of the highway, but we could talk about that more later. But I think it's both
We'd
the
want
land
to.
use, the form, the transportation, and protecting what we want.
Yeah, but what people like on this side of town, south,
Mm-hmm.
the walkability, that's why we like Sherwood. We like the quaint Sherwood feel, and having it on all parts of our community is
Well,
great.
yeah. So I mean, every principle that we'll talk about in terms of how to make Langer Drive more walkable, pedestrian friendly, all those sorts of things applies equally to Borchers, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely,
It certainly could.
Yeah,
absolutely.
it should,
Right. In fact, I'm hard pressed to think of what a reason would be that it wouldn't.
because there's that big, all those neighborhoods down.
Mm-hmm.
down
Let's go ahead.
Rogers.
Let's
Okay.
go ahead and plug ahead.
Very much a lot of development.
I'm not going to go into much detail on this because we've already discussed this a little bit just even this evening, and I know you discussed it before, but just to remind you of the town center boundary with the edges concept has the Langer Drive Commercial District, Central Neighborhoods, and Old Town. And while the policies and strategies don't specifically differentiate things by district, I guess I want to point out that you could, and one of the things that we want feedback from you this evening is, are there policies that are sub-district specific, or are there additional policies that you think we should have? And that's something else I want to kind of point out. A reminder of the structure, we've got the plan document includes the background and the policies, and then the action plan document includes the adoption package for what we had initially identified as sort of immediate action items, as well as short-term and next steps. Based on the feedback and kind of where we're at, I'm not sure that we're ready for all of the things that are in the adoption package, but we'll talk about that when we get into the policies. And kind of what I'm getting at, and I know there was some pushback at the Joint Council Planning Commission work session about me kind of throwing that idea out about maybe we don't need to implement this fully. Just in very simple terms, the comprehensive plan is the roadmap of where we want to go. That's the vision, the goals, the policies and strategies. And the implementing measures are how we get there. So for example, if you say I want to go from here to Mount Hood, well, what road do you want to take? When do you want to leave? Are you going to stop for lunch? Those are the things that you really talk about and get more into depth about in the implementing measures. And those would be in this, in a code situation, code changes, potential policies, procedure changes, even budget allocation for capital improvements, committees to talk about signage. Those are all part of what you do that helps you figure out how to get there, but you don't necessarily have to go down the path that we've identified in the action plan as the path. So I guess I want to.
Yeah, but at the risk of over torturing the Mount Hood metaphor, if going to Mount Hood means I'm going to take the old highway out the gorge and go around Hood River and do that loop and come back, I may want to do that trip, and if all it is out 26 and experience beautiful Gresham and back, I might not want to do the trip at all, right? That's my point about the interconnectedness of
Right.
the how and the what, and that it's really hard, I think, to just come up with goals in a vacuum of what do they imply for what the action
Right, and that's what we'll get into a little bit more when we get into the policies and strategies and what the action plan related elements are. And then we can talk about, like you said, is this something that we don't like anyway whatsoever, or is this something that we just maybe don't like this action plan item, or is it something we love? So that's we'll get there. Okay, so I'm going to have Michelle talk briefly about, she gave you the surveys, but talk just in a very nutshell version, the feedback that we received, and then we have 2 slides, so you know.
So as you're aware, we did the surveys on the different action items that we had in place and identified them really kind of quickly, not looking at any of the context of the town center plan. And so we have received a total of 64 comments. The survey's been up for about 3 weeks, I think, and really has trickled off lately. But there were some supportive survey measures. I think maybe not necessarily. We can kind of get some themes out of it, and basically the overriding comments were to preserve the unique characteristics of Old Town, and how do we create that theme, and that's really been the feedback overall. This isn't the first survey that we've done. We had the surveys through the open house and also initial surveys, and I think that that's an overriding theme, and so I think it's something that really, as you look at the policies, to really capture that and make sure that protectiveness of Old Town is preserved. And another comment through the stakeholder interviews, especially as well as some of the comments that we've received, is to allow the greater flexibility in the Old Town improvements, those minor modifications. And you've bumped up against this too. You've reviewed, shed removals through our Old Town design standards and demolitions of different buildings that really had no context, kind of in a vacuum. So how can we make it easier for development to occur the way that we want to, and is there some strategies that we can use to do that as well? Also, specifically remove the new motor vehicle related and land extensive uses. I think that is questions, a near-term action item, question 6, really shows a pretty high percentage of people as far as what they can be supportive of at this juncture. About 60% are strongly or somewhat supportive of those motor vehicle uses, and then those civic uses permit those outright. And I think that that's something really tangible that really doesn't need a lot of context or explanation through the plan. I think that people kind of get what those might mean and those implications of that. And also another overriding theme, I think, that's gone through the whole process. And I would argue, Lisa, that the things that improve walking and biking and gateways and those urban amenities are something that I think are pretty supportive for people and how to improve those connections. And I know Wade Anderson, who lives in the central neighborhood, who was one of those supporters, really said, we live in this neighborhood. We want to have easy access from 12th Street and Glen Eagle to get places, and we don't have sidewalks right now, and that would be something that our neighborhood could really benefit. We have an older neighborhood that we want to improve those connections. We have seniors that live there, people with disabilities in those, and providing accessibility throughout the whole area of the town center are some of the things that we're very, as far as the survey goes, as supportive. Now we got a lot of interest in the project, I think, from the overriding confusion with the town center and what does that mean? Is this the Walmart Town Center project? So really thinking about the context of where we're getting this feedback is also something, overriding that confusion, especially with the boundary, and whether are you talking about the Walmart Development Town Center boundary, or what does that mean? So looking at it, through that lens a little bit.
Just because it fits here where you've got reference to Old Town, something I've kind of come to the realization of over the last couple of weeks is, as distinguished from the Six Corners area, what I think about Old Town actually almost varies parcel by parcel in terms of what I think makes sense or is a good idea. The parcel that's up at the corner of Third and Pine and Sherwood Boulevard, to me, is an entirely different animal than the old Robin Hood Theater lot, which is itself yet very different from these 3 lots that are over behind the produce market, which is entirely different from the old Fisher Roofing site. Each of which I think could have markedly different kinds of things and different intensities of use, different heights. I mean, the whole gamut, depending on what's right around them and how they fit into development. And I'm not sure. This is an interesting comment in terms of preserving the unique character of Old Town. I think that's something that we've all heard since we've been in Sherwood, whenever that is. I certainly heard that when Old Town was full of corrugated metal buildings. Right.
Yes.
Or dilapidated storefronts that have pretty much all been renovated and those kinds of things. So trying to figure out what that really means is tricky. And for me, it really is place by place by place rather than some uniform within a certain boundary. It's all the same stuff.
Well, and I don't think it's anything we can really put code to. I think it's happened so organically over the years, and as it's developed, it's done pretty well with the support that the city's given it, in terms of the infrastructure and certain aspects of what can we do to really help it along. But it really takes kind of the people that have a vision themselves, that local people, to come and say, I want to have a little business in Old Town, with that dream in mind. And that's how it's kind of happened over time. And I think that the stakeholders really recognize that what you're talking about there, Patrick, with one side of Pine Street is really where those historic homes are, and that kind of that character of those residential properties. And then as you move as we're coming more toward where this building's located, and that aspect, that there's some redevelopment potential, and it could turn out looking a little bit more differently and more commercialized over time. And that's where there's some gaps that we could really strategically think about how that could look. And what we'd want to see there.
And that's where I'd see through this process, we could create a protection area in Old Town that incorporates the Old Town Overlay District, but somehow this plan says it's easier to do the right thing if we can identify the right thing. And I understand the whole problem of how to codify something that looks good and feels good. It's almost impossible, but we've tried it with our best with the Old Town Overlay District, and how can we incorporate this plan that makes it easier so someone doesn't have to pay a conditional use permit to reface the outside of their building?
Yeah, so one of the markers I'd like to put down for us to discuss is whether the best way to do that is not through a town center plan that incorporates the Old Town area, but rather moving the Old Town area out of the town center plan and instead revisiting the Old Town Overlay Plan as the tool to have that discussion about what development looks like in Old Town.
Well, it could be a strategy. Really, the Old Town design standards were kind of a broad brush in a lot of ways that really need to be fine-tuned and tweaked a bit to really improve the vision for everything. You take that property, for example, right behind us here, we've got 3 vacant lots zoned differently. We've got a commercial property and 2 residential that they can't do anything but put single-family homes up at this point in time, in one residential development. So is that what we want to see across there, where the whole block is commercialized at this point in time and adjacent to that? So kind of think about that as we move forward, and what would you want to see there to help fill in some of these gaps. And so taking a little bit of look at what are some obvious not supportive at that time, I think that policy 2 really is a glaring example of how that's phrased. Higher residential density really put red flags up for a lot of people, and I think that we need to be carefully construct how that looks and evaluate that in a little easier way or a slower way, slow that down a little bit and kind of think about how that is evaluated. And moving too fast, changing things too fast, even if it is a long-term item or way. So that's kind of where I got. Oops, sorry.
And so this is where we roll up our sleeves and dive in more than we've already been rolling up our sleeves and diving in. And the way I've got this planned is that we're going to go, if you don't object, policy by policy and really talk about the policy and the strategies that were identified as going with it. And then I've also identified what action items related to that policy. So the first policy is that the city will support programs and improvements that facilitate a greater awareness of the unique characteristics of the town center and that help inform visitors of the attractions in the area. And then we've got 4 policies, primarily related to signage and wayfinding and that kind of thing. There are some action items that were identified as supportive, but they were more in the longer term bucket. So I need to find those. So action 23 is identifying appropriate street furnishings and other features and streetscape treatments. 24 was convening a signage task force. 25 was pursuing funding for streetscape and gateway improvement projects. 26 was partnering with the Cultural Arts Commission to maybe have some design competitions. And 27 was exploring the feasibility of creating an awareness campaign and marketing strategy.
For what it's worth, the numbers, all the actions are the same ones. The numbers you just read off are one number off of the ones that I have on this worksheet.
The
Oh.
worksheet's misnumbered.
Yeah.
The worksheet's misnumbered.
If you
Yes.
start at action item on your worksheet number 14 and
Yeah.
change it to 15,
We're good after that. Okay.
it's one off from 14 down.
Okay.
So my comment on the policy and the strategies is this doesn't seem to have any code implications as much as it has directing someone else to do something, directing the economic development department to do something, directing cultural arts to do something. So
Well, the only comment I would make about that is to be careful because wayfinding was the title under which we got the much beloved monuments on the corners in Old Town. And so sort of the implications of what some of this stuff means could end up having an impact if we don't pay close attention.
yeah, and I kind of, and
The way they're
sorry my
worded.
comment, but if we have Old Town Blue, Cannery Black, can we have Town Center Green? I mean, I don't know. That's my funny humor is I don't know how it changes because it doesn't happen in code. It happens by a policy decision or the purchase order that's written at the time that it's bought. I think it's great to have cohesive signs that points everybody in the right direction, but I don't know how you do it in the code.
And I don't think the point is that you do it in a code. I think the identification, basically what this is doing is identifying, hey, we might want to talk about having a more cohesive wayfinding and gateway project. Any other thoughts or comments on policy 1 or the strategies?
Well, and this was firmly in the category of things that the stakeholder input and survey input that we've had it puts it on the category of things that are generally well supported, right?
Right.
And it's okay.
At least for purposes of moving forward to then go out and hear more from the public and see if we've just
Right.
totally misunderstood that.
And my notes on the action items for some of those were, maybe they're not even long-term. A couple that were long-term, like you had, I think 23 was in long-term, and some of them, they seem pretty straightforward and maybe could be moved up even. Because this is probably the easiest of all the policies.
I think though, I mean, that's, I think they're not things that you can do
Okay.
with the adoption, and it's things
No.
that the city has to add to their work plans and their
Okay.
funding and that kind of thing. So it's certainly moving you in a forward direction, but it's not something that can happen immediately.
So strategy 1.3 would, correct me if I'm wrong, show up in things like engineering standards and pattern books and those kinds of things. Is that right?
It certainly could. Darcy, do you?
I think it's mostly the public right of way, so it's going to be, pardon me. Yeah, so this would show up possibly in a long-term plan or, like you said, a pattern book. But a lot of that will be public investment. It won't be.
Well, no, not necessarily, because it would. Even if there's development going on that requires changes to frontage, ordinarily the city would say you'll pay for frontage improvements and buy this light pole and build a sidewalk that looks like, has this profile. Bob, is that right?
That is correct. Usually if it's within the right-of-way, the standards that we have, that we develop as a group or whatever that is approved by city, we utilize that. We could do it in different areas, like with the Downtown Streetscapes project. We tried to maintain a same standard throughout the project with, in this case, rollover curbs. We modified it, but we tried to keep the aesthetics the same. Sidewalk widths, textures, materials, things like that. So you're right.
So I guess one of the questions that we would have is who will own that?
That responsibility? Is that,
Yeah, and ultimately accountability for how that looks. And what I'm interested in is, among other things, is if we're going to get beat around the face and shoulders over blue light poles, I'd like to actually have been my fault, as opposed to having it just sort of happen and no one really was responsible for some sort of overarching. That wasn't really a policy call anybody made. It just kind of happened. For the record, I don't think the blue lights are going to ruin Sherwood or have ruined Sherwood, but that was a big deal at the time, right? And so clearly knowing who owns that stuff from a policymaking body standpoint, I think would be really helpful.
and I think that's a great comment. And as we were starting to talk about it, I was thinking that maybe it's more, work with, and maybe we need to come up with some draft recommendations, or Bob, if you have any off the top of your head, where it's sort of like the wayfinding committee. It's like work to identify, the cohesive public improvements, or a public improvement design plan for these corridors. I don't know, Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I always try and look back at what we do with it's the level of what type of detail do you get down to. It's the TSP, I can only sort of put it in context of like the
Transportation Systems Plan.
The Transportation Systems Plan tells me what components, the street sections for each individual type of designation, what I should be looking at for widths, not necessarily the materials, but it does tell me we want for residential streets, we want this width between the curbs, we want planter strips, we want sidewalks this wide. Then we go into neighborhoods, collectors, and arterials. I take that information, that is my guideline, that's my policy sort of starting me up. And I take it down the next step, which is making sure that the materials are appropriate for the intended the stylistic sort of stuff that they want, the feel. And then I take the technical side of it. You're going to use this type of concrete, this type of finish to it, this type of whatever is going to be in there. So with a simple guideline, such as the TSP, a modification of the TSP, you could have something like this, where it would say, okay, for this area, this designated area, we want this type of feel to it. We want these type of curbs, we want these types of sidewalks. I take that sort of guideline and then turn it into, okay, based on that, here's the materials that you have to do that make that whole thing come together. So I take the technical side of it and make it all cohesive at that point.
But this is even one step beyond that in a way, because it is wayfinding and there's a different mission. And it's something that probably is not going to happen incrementally. It won't be, parcel by parcel or development by development where you require a sidewalk, for example. You're going to be requiring certain type of treatments that are going to lead people somewhere. They're going to tell people that they are somewhere special. So it's going to require another kind of planning process and another, what are we trying to do? What are our objectives? What's our style? What are we trying to project as a community? And it will get very specific, where a TSP might not get down to, I won't talk in turn because I'm not a transportation engineer, but we're really talking about materials here and waste baskets and benches and color and
So
materials.
You're talking about a capital investment of the city in the long term to improve all of the public signs, not designating what the private individuals would do at the time of development.
Right, and that doesn't mean that there can't be private investment involved.
You're
But,
That's-
but I think that
That's the difference.
Yeah,
is-
that's the key. Is that I think what we'll end up finding is that single public investment that would do everything isn't feasible anyway, and so at least a component of that will be an as-developed kind of investment strategy, depending on where we're talking about exactly.
For example, the next phase of this particular commercial property would include the lampposts and a bench that matches the rest of the gateway.
Well, let's leap to the notion that we wanted to add the theater parcel into this boundary, and we were adopting standards with an eye toward future redevelopment of some kind at some point, of that property, and we would have these standards in place. Then depending on whether we would think some piece of that is a key route, turning the driveway into a public road, for instance, that would want to be consistent with this, and that's the kind of thing we would impose on a redeveloper, as an example, just sort of, thinking out loud, not.
So I guess, go ahead.
I'd say that there are communities, like Happy Valley is one of them, that have adopted pattern guides, that this is what they want their community feel to look like. And so when development comes in, the expectation is that you're looking at this and you are planning it. And we go so far as to prescribe the lamppost style, but you could theoretically go so far as saying we want waste baskets positioned along the right-of-way in our commercial areas, and we want benches in our commercial areas, and these are the options that you as a developer have. I mean, it depends on how onerous you want to get on the development community.
And I guess the bottom line is that it would, like Darcy said, it would be an additional process and an additional step. Many of these strategies require next steps and next processes. I think the language could be altered a little bit to reflect that it's not that staff is going to do this. It's going to be, working with, or going through a process to adopt or something like that.
So, do any of these strategies give anybody a major migraine?
In the future, it might.
Okay.
So are you suggesting
Do you need to declare a potential conflict?
So you're suggesting that you're going to look at maybe changing some of this language to be a little bit more, to include some of those things we talked about?
Yeah, that's my
Is that-
recommendation, and I know that some more people have come into the audience, so I want to reiterate that you're not taking any action now, you're not proposing any action now. All we're really doing tonight is discussing tweaks that need to be made before staff sends out notice to the agencies in preparation for public hearings, and we will continue discussing these policies and strategies and actions through public hearings, prior to public hearings, at public hearings, and that you're not making any action that's binding in any way whatsoever this evening.
So clarification on the strategies and policies might be helpful when we go to the next step, which is to designate long-term, short-term on these. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out. As we get the document ready to go to public hearing, do we want people to, when they read the document for our first public hearing, to understand that the strategies 1.1 to 1.4, the implementation time frame is 5 to 10 years or more?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. My suggestion would be that we actually figure out a way to display both the strategies as they line up with the policies, and then regrouping them based on short-term, medium-term, long-term, so that you get both senses.
Okay.
So when we go to public hearing.
Yeah, when we go to public hearing,
Yeah,
right.
so people will understand that
Right.
this is a great plan, but it's not going to happen next week after we get done with this
Right.
process.
That's a good point.
So let's move on to the next
That
one.
was the easy one.
Yeah.
It was.
I don't know how long we took, but.
Let's do this one and then plan to take a break after that.
Okay, so as Michelle mentioned, I think the policy that we've gotten the most feedback on is policy 2, and I think a lot of it's the way it's worded. The policy says the city will encourage higher residential densities and facilitate future development of appropriately scaled multifamily and single-family attached housing in targeted areas. The action items make it easier to do townhomes. I believe that they speak to the accessory dwelling units. Let me just go through those real quick. Action 15 is
Townhomes.
the townhome regulations, making those easier. 16 is modifying the existing accessory dwelling units. We already allow accessory dwelling units. The action item that was identified is making it easier to do larger ADUs and not necessarily have to have it, not have the same restrictions that we currently have on accessory dwelling units. Action 28 is encouraging and support rezoning residential areas in and adjacent to Old Town where property owners are interested in developing to higher densities. And 29 is explore the possibility of providing a density bonus to enable higher residential densities under existing zoning in areas within and in close proximity to Old Town. And really, the intent is if you're going to have a vibrant community, you need to have people in that community. You need to have businesses, you need to have residents, you need to have that ability to live and work and play all in the same area. And our current city, our current zoning allows development. And really what we're saying is, how do we make it easier to do the development that we want and maybe make it a little bit easier to get there quicker, and maybe have some additional densities. And that's really, so and that's, all of those we can discuss, but that's really in a nutshell what I think that policy is trying to achieve. And I know that's been really controversial. So I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that. I do have some suggestions on changing the wording of the policy to really get at what I think that we really are trying to get at, but I'll let you guys talk first.
I think your suggestion will help cut to the chase,
Okay.
though.
Well, my suggestion is to just say the city will encourage future development of appropriately scaled multifamily and single-family attached housing in targeted areas. So we're not talking about high density. We're talking about more people, more development of things that can already develop, and maybe making it easier to do the right things. So that's my suggestion, to kind of get rid of that.
Get rid of the word higher
right.
residential density.
But the higher density is residential, is it not? That you're asking for? We're not.
If you, by extension, if a strategy is to reduce the barriers to accessory dwelling units, thus you have more accessory dwelling units, that is higher density, right?
Okay.
Not necessarily higher than you would have. I mean, you may.
Well,
I don't know if we would have more accessory dwelling
Yeah,
units.
so let's take an imaginary block that allows accessory dwelling units and has barriers to their creation.
Mm-hmm.
That block, if you develop every last accessory dwelling unit you would have some number of accessory dwelling units. If you remove those barriers, that block would have more accessory dwelling units than if the barriers were still in place, right? If
Potentially.
in both
People want them.
scenarios you developed every single one you possibly could, and someone wanted to do that and all that stuff, right? All else being equal.
I guess I don't know that the existing standards are really barriers. I mean, they just are they're restrictions, they're limits. So it limits the size, it limits how it can be located on the property. But I don't know that that's saying you can't do it.
So the limits would not be how many to how many,
Right.
although it might be a limit to how many people could live in one,
Correct.
if it's size, for
Right.
instance.
Right.
Whereas if the limit has to do with placement on a lot, that probably wouldn't make much difference at all.
Right.
Depending on the configuration of your lot, the less restrictions there are to siting an accessory dwelling unit, the more likely you will actually be able to have one on a lot. So that's kind of the flexibility. You may be allowing more lots to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit by changing the code.
Can I
And
speak
people-
to this because I feel very
Thank you, sir.
passionate about accessory dwelling units because I've done a lot of research on these, and only from the standpoint that accessory dwelling units are also known as mother-in-law apartments. We have 13 to 16% of seniors hitting 65 now, and within the next 10 or 15 years, there's going to be 20% of us that are over 65 in this country, and we're having to figure out ways to house them. Accessory dwelling units is a way that people can house their family within their existing footprint of their home. But our existing code says that you are limited to 40% of the size of the gross habitable floor area. Now we have to go back and decide what's habitable and what's not habitable, and then you have to limit it based on that. So on a 1,000 square foot residence, that 40% is 400 square feet. So what this new action item says is that you're going to either do 40% or 600 square feet, whichever is the lesser of the two. Well, if you had a 4,000 square foot home and you were limited to 40%, you could theoretically have 1,000 square foot. So, for the larger homes, this is going to be a more limitation on the size of that accessory dwelling unit. Whereas in a smaller home, it's going to allow them, if you do have 1,000 square foot, to go up to 600 square feet as opposed to 400. And that could be in your basement, provided you meet all the building codes. It could be an attached to the house, an extension to the house, or it could be a detached accessory dwelling unit, like a guest house. And our current standard is that has to be separated from the primary residence by 10 feet, whereas the proposed action item would decrease that to 5 feet. I would suggest, or I think that Scott in the building department might have some even further things to say because it's going to also be dictated by the construction type. But I would say that this specific action item that is tied to the standard doesn't necessarily make it easier. I think it probably just says, clarifies it and says that we're not going to accept anything larger than 600 square feet, but you can go to 40%. It's already there. It's a standard that's already allowed.
Well, so I guess I'm really confused about what are we trying to do with strategy 2.2? Do we like accessory dwelling units and want them to be easier to do and have more of them, or do we want them to be smaller, or do we want, because if you're saying you can already do 40% and we're adding a limit of 600, we're not reducing the barrier, we're actually adding a barrier, right?
For the larger homes, yes, and reducing the barrier for smaller homes. So if you're talking about the town center area, think about the size of the homes. They're probably smaller homes. They're not probably what you're seeing, the 3,000 or 4,000 square foot homes. They're probably going to be anywhere from 1,200 to 1,800 square feet. So you could potentially be increasing the size of accessory dwelling units that they could accommodate.
So if we do whatever we think we would do under 2.2, in 20 years, would there be more accessory dwelling units than there would be if we didn't do it, or would there be the same?
Theoretically, yes, because we have a larger aging population.
That wasn't a yes or no
Well,
question.
I don't know that it's an answer. 'Cause we've had the accessory dwelling unit standards in place for at least 8 years, and I think we've had one person, 2 or 3, go through the process. So I don't know how many people would use it, and it's completely hypothetical to try to determine how this would apply.
Do we want there to be more? Does this plan a statement that our policy outcome is that we would want there to be more than are currently occurring?
Reduces the barriers to the addition of, so I'd say strategy 2.2.
That's what I would read into it too, but I'm not hearing that clearly.
I think that it's a recognition that there's not a lot of opportunities within this area to do anything that's going to bring
More bodies.
And this is an opportunity to within the existing code kind of open that up a little bit, but still not rezone things to high density residential.
So I can ask a question to the commission. Do you see this happening in both the Old Town and the Six Corner area? Do you?
Well, I don't see this in Six Corners at all.
Right.
No, I'm trying to figure out
Or the
whereabouts.
neighborhood, the central neighborhood district? Do you see it in Old Town
That's where I see it.
I see an Old Town and maybe in the residential area.
and that central neighborhood district?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody has too big of a problem with the accessory dwelling units. I think they just, when they see multifamily, higher density wording, they think of 3-story apartments. That's what they think.
I thought I
So-
heard a lot of concern about accessory dwelling units.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I thought so.
In the comments?
Yeah.
Yeah, right here.
Absolutely.
Page 37.
Okay.
Absolutely. not.
45 strongly present. 45% strongly.
All right, I'm mistaken. I didn't think that. I don't think they really know what they are. I would
I'm
be
just trying to
surprised.
envision what
That doesn't
what the
prevent strong
residential
opinions.
district would look
True.
like with all these accessory buildings.
So it might
I mean,
need to do
not saying
some
it would happen, but if it did happen, what would that look like? And is that
And-
something that we want, that we have envisioned for our town?
Yeah, and again, almost kind of parcel by parcel. If what we mean by that is you want to make it easy for someone to remodel their garage to have an apartment above it, I don't think I have a big problem with that. You know, if you live in the kind of a property, in the kind of a house that has a garage where you can do that, as opposed to one that's already integrated into your house. If that means putting a smaller second house on an already small parcel, I think I have big problems with that.
I do
That's,
because, it changes,
Changes the look and feel of the that particular. Part of the
it
community.
impacts the neighbors. I
Right.
mean, significantly.
I have a suggestion based on both what I'm hearing, but also what I'm trying to move towards as far as a recommendation with us not dwelling on the action item details, but dwelling on the policy and strategies. And I think that reducing the barriers is really probably not an accurate phrasing, because it's not necessarily reducing it in all cases. And I think what we're really trying to say is examine, and I'm sort of punting. You're going to notice I'm doing a lot of punting with these strategies, but the idea is I want to have a framework that then we can work on more in the future. But if we had something that said something like, examine accessory dwelling units within the different districts in the town center, and maybe we want to have some, one of the things that we heard from the Glen Eagle neighborhood was, initially concerned about the accessory dwelling units. And maybe we want to have some design standards for accessory dwelling units in some areas, but not others. And I think that we need to continue the conversation, but I don't know that saying reducing barriers is really getting at what we want. I think we want to examine how accessory dwelling units can be done in a way that doesn't look like little houses behind big houses.
Yeah, I think if you guys could put your heads together and come up with some different ways to describe what that strategy is, because I think amongst you I hear actually dramatically different things, that would be helpful.
Okay.
But what I'm seeing on the survey and what we're hearing is that what's written here, we're not comfortable with the way this language is written.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like, what I'm hearing from the comments is that we have a developed area. How can we redevelop that into a more higher density? And I think people are having a hard time of how do they grasp that concept and what's that going to look like and develop into? And I think there's too much unknown, and I think the wording might be misleading.
Well, and it really does, some of this stuff really does get at phrasing, and to Brad's point, if the question we asked is, should the city make it easier for you to remodel your property to accommodate a family member living with you? I think most people would say, well, yeah, we should do that. And it's that difference between that and a second house that you rent out to whomever, and
Right.
the vast space between those.
And I'm also concerned that the term transit supportive density in and adjacent to Old Town, transit supported density in Metro's definition is 20 to 40 units per acre, right? Can we define that better than, I don't.
What does that word mean? What does transit supportive mean?
Something more tangible.
So,
I don't know that Metro specifically defines that as transit supportive. Darcy, can you?
No, it's difficult to find actually anyone who will pin down what exactly that is, because
Gene will.
transit service providers make their decisions not only along population or populace lines. They have other concerns, but the important part of this policy and the strategies that go with it really does get to how can we accommodate more people in appropriate areas, but allow for that that increase in activity, that increase in people living in your town center, wherever that may be. So in answer to your question, Commissioner Allen, I would say yes, you are with this policy trying to increase residential densities. Now, where that happens is kind of what the conversation is, and it does go back to your boundary discussion. But what Julia is suggesting, I think, is to take the language up a level and more into the policy realm, and that you use words like explore or, look into. And I think we can do that with some of these policies that make them more open-ended, in that we're not concluding that there is an immediate action necessarily, or that the action that had been identified previously may need to be modified, to step back and find out what that appropriate next step actually is.
I don't know. I guess I'm going to channel my inner Yoda and say that in this context, I'm not sure that there is no explore. There is do or do not, right?
When you get to the strategies, yeah.
I don't get explore as a strategy.
I can see it in the policy, but when you start saying allow and
Right.
create,
Well, for example, a
means
recommendation
do.
I had for strategy 2.1 is explore ways to create more opportunities for townhome development in Old Town that continues to respect the Old Town feel and historic context.
which means more townhomes. Yes.
But maybe, but in a way that maybe there's design standards, or maybe, there's certain things that you can already do.
I don't think explore is. I personally don't think explore is a verb that works in the plan.
Okay.
Because then what do you do? Then what? Once you've finished exploring, then what?
I guess what that's saying is that we want to think about it, but we recognize that we don't have the answers yet. That we want to have a conversation about are there ways to do this in a way that is complementary to the town center.
Then I would say don't put it in the plan, and meantime let's explore. And if at the end of our exploration we find something we like, amend the plan and put it in.
And I agree with that, because in 5 years, when someone comes in with an application or a code change, and that applicant comes to you with an adopted plan that says you were going to explore opportunities for townhomes, I am bringing you an application that is exploring opportunities for townhomes, and now we're committed.
Or we'll feel, or we'll
Or
feel
very-
committed, or be encouraged to feel that we're committed, or
right, I
It's
think
very hard to
version of
fight.
that.
So are there any policies, is there anything in this policy or any strategy that you support?
No, I'm not saying I don't support anything in this strategy. I'm saying substituting the word explore
Okay.
doesn't help.
Okay.
Right. So, for instance, I'm looking at 2.1 and 2.4, the townhome development and its close cousin, transit supportive density, both of which in or adjacent to Old Town. Back to my parcel by parcel, I don't know that I would necessarily have a big problem with a townhome development at the Robin Hood lot, where it's it's clearly within the urban area. It's got commercial neighbors around it. It contributes. It's got access to transit. It contributes to the notion of more people living in Old Town to increase the business volume, all those kinds of things. That's different than saying that any of the residential lots along 2nd Street, someone, kind of like Northwest Portland 15 years ago, someone can come tear down houses and put in townhomes. I think that would be a terrible idea.
So that's a conditional use. That's a conditional use already in Old Town, is to have townhomes on that retail commercial district. So they would just have to add a conditional use permit, which is kind of a barrier in some ways.
So why wouldn't? So if we want to do this, then why wouldn't we actually if that was a consensus and everybody decided that was all a good thing to do, wouldn't it make more sense to take that parcel or parcels that we found to be like it, and maybe make it a use outright rather than a conditional use?
Just on those parcels?
Just on those parcels, yeah.
Can you do that within a whole?
You can make zones that are small.
We could do it. It would not necessarily be pretty or easy, but I guess what I'm trying to get though is, how do we move forward? If you're comfortable with a strategy that says create more opportunities for townhome development in Old Town Overlay District, part of what we talked about at the beginning of the evening is kind of what are the parameters of what that might mean, and are you comfortable with any or all of those?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I thought I was hearing that, no, you weren't comfortable with any of them, and I'm seeing Lisa, and I'm thinking she's not. But, and that's, I guess, why I'm saying, we're not saying we will do this. If we had something that said, hey, I think we need to discuss this more, I think that would.
So how does that get to be something that we just discuss more and isn't written down, so next, 3 months from now, somebody doesn't come in with a plan that says we're going to create that opportunity?
Well, I'm hoping that you guys can either figure out how to, and again,
Word it.
we're not making anything tonight, but maybe we need to think about this. Maybe we leave this in for the notice, and this is something that we really delve into and talk about. But do we take it out?
Yeah,
Do
so
we
my
modify it in a way
individual
that we're comfortable with?
my individual perspective is, depending on how it would be executed and exactly where it would be executed, I'm interested in hearing more from the public on 2.1 and 2.4 about townhomes and other Old Town residential development. I'm interested in different language for 2.2 on accessory dwelling units, because I don't know what this means right now, and I'm not remotely interested in 2.3 in terms of greater density multifamily residential or mixed-use projects. Well, I should divide the two halves of that. A greater density multifamily residential in proximity to commercial, I'm not interested in. I would need to know more about what mixed-use projects means.
I can agree with that.
That's my take.
Hard.
And that's hard, and I would like to hear, and I wish Russell was still here, the stakeholders that were part of the Old Town and the Old Town merchants. Those are the people that we really need to reach out to. And one of my comments for a reach out was this is a lot of information for any one person to read, but there are a couple policies that I could pick out, and you could send it to the Old Town Merchants Association and say, hey, policy 2 is driving these strategies. These action items look like this. As an Old Town group, residents and business owners, what's your input on this?
So I would speak to Charles Harbeck, was on the SERPAC, and they kind of started morphing into the idea that one section of Old Town should be kind of the slower, keeping it preserved, and the other side, like Pine Street, thinking about more intensification. And Russell, who lives here as well and has business, was participating kind of in that discussion as far as acknowledging that they need to have more people down here to get the activity level up.
But the people that live down here don't want to see the things that require new people. And so you've got to figure out how that works.
Kind of, it worked on that one side necessarily of Old Town, and
That's
the
dividing
others.
it up again.
This side could see more activity potentially, and there's more opportunities.
And I guess I'd argue that not everybody in Old Town, there are certainly some people that live in Old Town that were supportive of more density. They lived in the higher, the multi-story buildings, so.
Just generic comment. Sorry about that. But yeah, it would be, this is one to revisit, and if I would feel better removing the policy completely if we can't clearly define what our goal is, because having something that we can't get our hands around, to me, creates something has unintended consequences. I'm very nervous about this one if we don't craft it right.
So my recommendation would be to try to tweak the words a little bit for notice, do what you guys suggested, which is really try to reach out to specific groups and to the public at large for their feedback on the specific policy, the policy in general, but also the strategies, and have that conversation.
And what the action items associated. I think they need the whole package.
But 2.2 we're going to rework significantly, right?
Yes.
Can we split 2.3 into 2.3 A and B?
Sure. How would you propose splitting it?
Commercial
Greater
area.
density and multifamily residential is A, and mixed-use projects in the town center is B.
Okay.
The comma.
And mixed use, do you mean that for both the commercial area and the Old Town area?
Well, this 2.3 as it's written now, I'm assuming is not in the Old Town area. Am I reading that wrong?
It's
No,
town
it's
center.
the town center. It's Old Town
Everywhere.
also. That's where I think
Some of these are
Yeah,
referencing Old
that's-
Town, some of them are
that's a
referencing
good
Town
point.
Center.
this works for one area, but it doesn't work for the other area.
Well, even that's not necessarily true.
Well-
The Fisher roofing site, it may.
Site by site.
Right, exactly.
If you can do that, that would probably be the best, but I don't know how the germs
Well,
are
so
on
let's. My
You're just
suggestion.
wanting to set us up for that, and then you're going to be gone.
Way to go.
It took you this long to catch on to that. My monitor keeps cutting out. I don't know if anyone.
So before we move on to the next policy, Darcy, did you have anything to add? You look like you're ready to say something.
I'm not sure how to be the most helpful, so I don't want to impede your forward progress as you go into the next policy. But
But here it comes.
but the housing is really key. It's key to town center planning, and I know Commissioner Simpson, you're grappling with, well, who are we doing this plan for, and what are we doing it for, and shouldn't we be addressing different areas than what's identified in this draft town center plan? And all of those are very valid questions. But the start of the exercise really was, where a town center, pursuant to a regional definition, where that might go in Sherwood. And in order to do town center planning, you do really need to look at your densities and if you have enough people to support transit. So transit supportive is definitely a recurring theme in the literature. And it is, just one of those things that if you are going to get a really active downtown area, if you're going to get a town center that is active more than just a certain hour of time, but more extended into the nighttime, into the restaurant and bar hours, things like that, you have to have bodies. And so it's kind of this package, and why it's really focused on in this plan is it's something that Sherwood doesn't have yet. And it's just one of those things where we noticed that through this planning process and are recommending some tweaks that would allow you to have more of what you're already getting, really. So I wanted to mention that it's mixed use, it's transit supportive densities. Those are the things that you're looking for in the town center. So to kind of take residential out of the policy itself, even I think maybe is a bit problematic because it's the only policy that really focuses on where can more people be accommodated in a way that makes sense for Sherwood. So that was one of the things I wanted to mention before we left. Before they left this one.
And one thing I want to make sure we get for you prior to the next either work session or at the public hearings, but I'm thinking that we'll probably have an additional conversation about this before we get to public hearings. I want to get what our existing population and density is in Old Town, what our zoned population and density in Old Town is, and then also what the projections are. And I think we have that, but I don't know if we have that readily available.
Some examples maybe of what, you said, like you put the townhomes on the Robin Hood Theater land, and just maybe that can help us visualize what we might be talking and the public.
Right.
That raises maybe another way to look at this, at least for me, which is assuming that our actual density is below our zoned density, what steps would allow us to close the gap without changing, without increasing allowed density? What would cause us to achieve more of what's allowed?
Exactly, and that's kind of what a lot of these strategies get to, is removing the barriers that you're already allowed to do it, but it's so problematic that people don't do it. But it's zoned that way.
Yeah, so if we could talk more explicitly in those terms, that would be really helpful.
So I guess where I was getting my numbers from is this really big binder you gave me.
Which page is that?
Who gave her the binder?
Who gave me a binder to read?
We should have known.
Page 12.
Page 12. Resident and employee density. A specified density of residents and employees per acre is recommended for each place type in order to make them vibrant. Town centers, 40 persons per acre.
And that's recommended. It is not mandated.
Right.
And Metro has been really clear about that as well.
And town center average for the metro area is 20 for the town center. That's
Do
on
we know
page
what ours
7.
is? Is that the question you just?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my
Okay.
head.
It would be
I think
12.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
0.3.
What the density is within
In the
town
project
center
area, it's
12.3.
12.3. If you go to the study area plus a
Just
whole
see
mile,
Mhm.
if you so you're kind of encompassing more of what Sherwood is.
Yeah.
It's 4.2. So
So we're already triple the density of the community as a whole
and
And looking to double it.
in the project area.
right, and so yes, those are
Yeah.
significant numbers.
Okay.
It's
Anything,
so nice to have you back on the
any,
planning.
anything else on this one?
I don't have anything.
All right, now let's take a 5-minute break
Okay.
before we come to policy 3 of 9.
Yes.
All right, let's reconvene and pick up with policy 3.
Hello. Okay, so policy 3. The city will ensure that development regulations encourage an appropriate mix of activities and uses within the town center that support the vision and recommendations included in the town center action plan. One recommendation I'll have right off the top is if we don't end up moving forward with the action plan as originally envisioned, we might want to eliminate the reference to the Sherwood action plan, but we can talk about that. There's 3 strategies that are really geared towards the uses, moving away from auto-oriented uses, allowing more specifically certain uses that we want to have within the town center, like civic uses and things like that, and then restricting drive-through commercial uses. The action plan that goes with this policy, the items are action item 8, that basically is prohibiting some uses and allowing some specific uses within the town center, prohibiting uses that really don't seem to fit within the town center but are allowed in the general commercial and retail commercial zone, such as vehicle testing stations, cemeteries, auto sales, that kind of thing.
We
Yeah.
did a fair amount of that in code cleanup, didn't
Mhm.
we?
We did, but there was a lot of uses that we allow in concept within the city, but we may not want to have within the town center.
Okay.
So, in retail commercial zones, it might be appropriate, but in a retail commercial zone in our town center, maybe
Okay.
not.
I mean, auto sales, for instance, I thought we had made that pretty hard to do anywhere.
Yes, and I misspoke, I'm sorry. Motorized vehicles, sport craft and farm equipment rental and sales. I'll have to look at this because this may have been, they were working on this as we were in the transition of our code cleanup, so I need to look more specifically at that.
Okay.
Action item 9.
So we're especially in favor of strategies we've already implemented.
Yes, that's an easy win. Unless it's a bad strategy. Action 9 is prohibiting construction of new drive-through facilities, and as Michelle said, we got some support from that on in the surveys, but we've also heard some feedback with concerns about that, so that may be something that we want to talk about. 10 is allowing uses outright rather than conditional, such as libraries, museums, community centers, things that you want to have more easily done, making it easier to do the right thing within your town center.
So that sort of assumes that those investments would be done in a way that's consistent with the spirit of this, without our really saying that that's required, right? And I mean,
Right.
What I think of, there are a bunch of different civic investments we've made. Some, like this building, are consistent. Some, like the police facility, are pretty inconsistent. Do we need to say more than just civic investments?
This doesn't say civic investments. This is basically
Civic
lists
uses, rather, excuse me.
Well, it doesn't even say civic uses, at least in the action item. It lists libraries, museums, community centers, senior centers, public recreation facilities, schools, and then health clubs and studios greater than 5,000 square feet in size. You could have a
Mine
private
says
museum.
civic and commercial uses.
Where are you looking at?
He's looking
Action
at his
10.
matrix.
Oh,
Are you?
Yeah.
I short-jumped some of them.
Yeah.
so that's not the full action
Okay.
plan list.
I didn't write all those. What?
So, and then action 14 is within the town center overlay along.
I guess I'm just before leaving that. All I'm suggesting is saying something is good because of the nature of its use probably by itself isn't sufficient given our history of how those investments actually happen, that we probably need to say more about
Okay.
about their character.
Action 14 is within the town center overlay along Sherwood Boulevard, allow mixed-use development on parcels zoned high-density residential. So
It's
that's,
not on our page.
It's not on there.
Yeah.
That's the one that starts the.
Missing,
Oh.
right?
That's the missing one.
It's just shorthanded a little bit.
It's not.
No,
it's
that's
not
the
on
one
here.
that's
the
missing.
missing
That
one.
causes the numbering to be off.
Yes.
okay,
14
so,
was a late
So
ad.
that was
That was-
allow mixed use on high density residential on Sherwood Boulevard.
yeah. So that's policy 3 and the strategies that are recommended to go with that. And then the potential action items that could implement it. And again, you don't have to have that exact language in the action item. It's, are you comfortable with the policy and strategies and the action items that might go with that?
So based on the action items, there are action items that seem to make sense for Old Town, like not having drive-throughs, but it would be prohibitive to not have a drive-through opportunity on the Albertsons area. And that's where I was challenged by that policy that encompasses two distinct areas.
So in this case, I think what Jean is suggesting is having sort of separate strategies for the different areas.
Or you've called out specifically on Sherwood Boulevard, you know, excluding Old Town or inclusive of Old Town.
Could you go over what 14 is again?
Sure. 14 states, within the town center overlay along Sherwood Boulevard, allow mixed-use development on parcels zoned high-density residential. And
that's basically the vacant lot that's surrounded by the giant cedar hedge.
yeah, there's a few high-density residential lots, including the city owns that property that was, we were trying to get as senior housing, but it never
Yeah.
came to fruition. So there's a few high-density residential parcels across from the school primarily that this could apply to.
And so, in other words, those could already be. I mean, this is one I know I heard a fair amount of back and forth on. That's an area that could already be built today as apartments,
Right.
given
Well,
configuration, depending on
Given
size
the density,
and
I
configuration, that kind
can't
of thing.
confirm that
Right.
they will, that
Right.
they are zoned high-density residential.
Right. So this is allowing something different than mixed use. So ground floor commercial, upper floor residential, or whatever.
Right.
Okay. Or mixed use by building or something like that. Okay.
And one thing that I'm noticing just right now is the action plan identifies this is related to policy 3, strategy 3.2. And maybe we want to be more specific. Oh, okay. That, because the strategy doesn't really talk about the mixed use or anything like that. So that might be something that you want to be a little bit more clear on if that is something that you support as a strategy.
So there really isn't a strategy that mentions this outright, is what you're saying.
Well, I would conversely see that strategy 3.2 is so vague in its nature, we're opening the door to just about anything.
Yeah.
Except those uses that are been kind of identified as not being pedestrian friendly. So.
So the strategy is allow uses in the town center that are consistent with the town center vision and goals.
Which really says,
It does seem awfully broad.
or unnecessary.
By the way, I just looked at the map, and actually almost everything across from both the middle school and Hopkins is zoned high-density residential.
Yeah, some of it's already developed high-density residential, but,
Right.
right. So there's only a few vacant parcels that this would apply to.
Right.
That would be like a school board or parent teachers group that you would reach out to and say, across from here, we're proposing this. Is that?
And we did have, Michelle's whispering away, we did have someone on the stakeholder advisory committee from the school board, so, from the school district. But we can certainly reach out further, so.
Because that to me, if we're calling out Sherwood Boulevard to say not only, expectation is it's high density residential, so we're going to have a residential community across from our school. We're saying that part of this plan is to allow an additional use, a commercial use across from that. If we allow a mixed use without clear definitions. I think that's a.
Well, and we've already got some of that because years ago we did the neighborhood commercial rezone on I think it was on the Height House lot, right?
Yeah.
And I guess my question to you is, do you think that strategy leads one to the logical conclusion that mixed uses or civic uses would be what's permitted? Or what we want to encourage, what we want to move forward with potential code amendments to achieve?
Well, I would want more interaction with the school district for sure.
Okay.
On that point.
That will be you in a few months.
In a bit.
Talk to yourself about that and get back to us.
Yeah, it's talking to myself isn't the problem. It's when I start hearing answers, I get concerned.
So any other feedback on those strategies?
So
We need to know. I think we need to either pitch 3.2 or define it better.
Right.
Right, but the strategy is on overarching on purpose because it sets you up for all of those action items. It basically sets you up for allowing or not allowing uses, for changing your overlay or having one.
Totally understand. I think the community's trust level for broad overarching principles that aren't well defined is really, really low right now.
So we'll work on defining that better.
Okay.
okay, yeah, because I'm going back to the town center vision statement, and it's as broad as it can be about encompassing everything, and then we have allow uses that encompass everything, and
Right.
that
Everything.
Right. Okay.
Anything else on 3?
Anything else on 3?
So we're okay with 3.1 and 3.3, the drive-through? Or we were talking about on 3.3 dividing that up?
Yeah, dividing it.
Okay. Between Old Town and Six Corners.
And again, obviously, once this really moves forward into the adoption phase, I'm sure we'll get a lot of input on the auto-oriented and drive-through uses. And so, it may be that as you proceed, you may decide to get rid of them. Or I guess one question before we move forward with noticing, do you want me to divide them up as Jean suggested into Old Town and the Langer Farms Commercial District?
I don't know about separating, but designating like you did with Sherwood Boulevard. That is a very defined.
Okay.
Encourage
So-
because to say encourage a transition away from auto-oriented on the Albertsons parking lot at the corner of 99 and 12th and Sherwood Road is now just put a barrier in the way of someone being able to do something. Not that they couldn't do a lot more because they have pedestrian friendly stuff that they can do, but if this overlay town center district then tells them they can't put a drive-through or redevelop with a pharmacy that has or a bank or so many other of those drive-throughs, we've created a problem, I think. So.
Yeah, I mean, so let's say the worst fears are true and Albertsons were to close, right? Have we layered so much stuff on there that what we do is guarantee a vacant big box for a long time?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a fine line we're going to have to walk of, what would we love to have versus what's going to be feasible and not create a long-term problem.
And is there a difference between is there a difference between the drive-through of a bank, which is not going to be as high as a fast food restaurant? Have we had any designation between drive-through?
There certainly can be. In Old Town, we actually do have a prohibition on drive-through restaurants, but not other drive-throughs. So that's certainly something that we can talk about. So I got sort of stuck on what Jean was saying. As right now, the strategy 3.1 says, commercial uses in the Langer Drive district. I don't think we want to be as specific as to say the Albertsons parking lot at the corner of. I mean, I
Well,
hope
no,
that,
that's not what I meant.
You're
but
I hope that's
That was
not
an-
what you
I think
meant.
that was
Okay, I
an
just wanted to
example.
clarify.
Well, what I'm saying is that's what we're saying is that intersection that has this.
Well, that's not all that it's saying. It's also saying that in the Safari Sam's parking lot, in the Target parking lot. So it's not just the Albertsons parking lot, it's any other parking lot.
But we're applying all those same criteria.
Right.
That's what my boggle is.
Right.
But
And
not
my-
to Safeway.
But not to Safeway, right? And that's the boggle, is how can we, I can't stand behind something that limits the ability of a development to pursue commercial activity when people 100 yards away across the street can do that. It just doesn't make any sense. If we have a town center designation that encompasses 6 corners and says we have a flavor or a feel or a look that we're going for, and Worshers and Langer Drive have the frontages that are pedestrian friendly, with the understanding that they are on a very major thoroughfare, they have to have the ability to still do business.
Okay, let's move on to form.
Okay, and I
With-
just want to, I guess, reiterate that all of these business, not all of these businesses, but property owners from many of these businesses were on the stakeholder advisory committee. We certainly could reach out to them more and make sure that do you understand that this is what this policy means? But we, they've been involved in this, and they have been invited to take the survey and invited to provide input. We definitely want to make sure that we talk to them specifically, so we go, do you know that this is what this means?
Well, the picture of Sherwood Boulevard with the very high density up next to the sidewalk, I mean, I want to make sure that, is that where we're going with this? If not, then, let's change the picture, at least in the handouts.
Okay. So
Or if
moving-
we are going that way, make sure the school knows they're going to have 3-story buildings across the street from the middle school.
Because they could have that now.
But not at the street. There's setbacks.
Yeah.
This plan calls for reducing setbacks.
So policy 4 says the city will ensure that new development and redevelopment within the town center contribute to a pedestrian-friendly environment with human-scale buildings and high-quality design. And you've got 3 strategies and 3 action items, and they are, so action item 11 is actually getting at what Jean just said, which is reducing the minimum setback in the neighborhood commercial, and then also single-family and attached multifamily housing, so that you have the buildings closer to the street. So you'd see that in Old Town, but also along Sherwood Boulevard. That's kind of where you'd see that the most. Action 12 is changing the design review matrix, the commercial design review matrix, to have a higher standard for buildings that are in the town center. And 13 is removing the height restrictions in Smockville and implementing the underlying retail commercial. So essentially increasing it to 4 stories or 50 feet.
So for people who might watch this video later, or people in the audience, when we talk about Smockville, there's an Old Town overlay that is on both sides of the railroad tracks, and it divides the side that's on the other side of the railroad tracks into the cannery section and the side on this side of the railroad tracks to the Smockville section.
And I think that
Smockvilles.
we've heard from a lot of people concerns about that height. And I imagine that that's feedback I will hear.
Well, this for me again, this is one of these site by site kinds of things. I don't think a 4-story building at the Robin Hood lot would be a problem, depending on a lot of other things besides its height. I might not think it's a problem on the Fisher Roofing site. Again, depending on a bunch of things besides just its height. I think 4-story building on the three lots behind Ray's Produce would be a really, really terrible idea. And so I have a hard time just sort of generically talking about this.
Where's the Fisher site?
That's right back here. the old road.
On the other
roofing?
side of the parking lot.
It's in this
Yeah.
big circle.
And the challenge with going forward and modifying your requirements, your code regulations, is coming up with clear and objective standards so that you're treating property owners with similarly zoned properties in the same way. So it will be difficult to go site by site unless, again, you can identify a district that may be very small or identify site characteristics that makes it okay for certain parcels to enjoy a higher, possibly a higher story.
So policy or strategy 4.3 specifically says allow and encourage buildings of up to 4 stories within the town center commercially zoned areas.
There are 65% of the people that say no. And I mean, that's a lot to.
Right.
It's a pretty strong opposition.
And then in another 10% had no opinion. So that is a lot of people that are no.
I know that Pat doesn't want to explore in strategy, but I'm wondering, I think that, I'm just, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, maybe you can do, 3 stories outright, 4 stories with a conditional use subject to these things. And so maybe there's still some opportunities to discuss this more and not throw it all out, but I think saying allow and encourage may be a little strong based on what feedback we've heard.
Why couldn't we just throw it all out?
You could.
What makes you want to keep it?
The fish roofing site for me. I think that actually is the most incredibly valuable mixed use potential site we have, and allowing a pretty wide palette of what could happen there, I think would get us more and better than really restricting it. Right now, its highest and best use is as a storage lot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But 4 stories, you couldn't do it with 3.
I don't know.
That's what people are unhappy. I mean, they're not, don't love 3, but it seems like the 4 is what's pushing them over the edge there, and they just can't see
Is the cannery lots that going to be 4 or 3 stories or 2 stories?
apartments.
Is the what?
The ones right across the ones are the commercial. That's not going to be developed. That's not developed yet.
I believe those are 3 stories.
Those are 3s.
But I honestly, I'd have to look and count. I don't remember off the top
The
of my
apartments are
head.
3 stories.
The apartments are 3 stories. I'm talking about the
yeah.
commercial.
Yeah,
and
those I
they're
think are only planned to be 2 stories.
Planned to be 2.
I would also add to that
It's
a
commercial.
lot of what drives that is going to be the construction costs, because once you get above 3 stories, you got to go from wood frame to steel beam construction, unless you do a podium style building or you're building on top, and then you can be for residential. It can be somewhat problematic and costly.
Residential. Commercial. So, and this is not residential, this is
This is
commercial.
commercially zoned.
So,
What would that be? Include a mixed use then, or not? In the
Or what was the
commercial-
question?
Well, for
Mixed use.
strategy 4.3, could that be a mixed use building or strictly commercial?
so residential above,
I think it
Commercial?
could be. I don't think if it's commercially zoned, it doesn't have to be, but I think it could be, especially in Old Town.
Okay. It just seems like a lot of the people have issues with the 4 stories.
Well, I mean, again, I'd be interested in hearing more public comment, particularly with a narrowed version of that. Now, I mean, it might be that there's no conceivable way we can narrow it that makes sense in terms of actually doing it. Because I agree that there are lots of places where 4 stories just would not make any sense, and you wouldn't want to have it happen. But I think there are places where it could actually work well, and I'd hate to foreclose that completely.
I'd have to agree.
the people living behind that Fisher place wouldn't probably want 4 stories there.
Well, but there's not. I mean, that's part of why it and the Robin Hood site.
There's no one
I
living
think
there.
are better is because they're
There isn't
surrounded by
something there?
major streets or railroad tracks or other commercial development.
Okay. So then the other
Fisher
thing,
roofing, partly yes, partly no.
and the other thing is that is 4.1. Are we just talking about 4.3 at the moment? Or do we're looking at this
We
whole
can talk
policy?
about whatever you want to talk about.
What was the public's opinion about the bringing the buildings and entries close to the sidewalk? What was the
I
general
think that
in-depth
was
consistent?
negatively received as well.
I've seen that done really attractively,
Yeah,
as I know that Russell was talking about.
We
55.
talked about Tualatin last time, or
Yeah.
at the city council meeting. we
Right.
talked
Yeah.
about it.
You know, that's really the,
2/3 said no.
yeah. And
I
maybe that
personally
would
like
be,
the idea.
Well, there I'd be interested in learning more about why.
Yeah.
maybe some pictures, because the one I've, the areas I've seen have been really attractively done. Many Wilsonville's like that. What we said,
Tualatin across the street
Tualatin
from
across
Hagen.
from Orinco Station, 100 off of Baseline and down there by the Mac Station, 173rd, all that redevelopment there. I mean, it's very nicely done. And I think people just in general just don't want it up close to the sidewalk. Maybe they can't see what it might look like. I know we have pictures, but
I find it interesting that they don't want it, but yet they like the old town.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Well, and I think that's, we definitely need to reach out more and more thoroughly. I know that some people, said that they spent hours going through the plan and answering the questions. Others, I don't know if they did. And so, there may have just been a very quick knee-jerk reaction to the concept without really delving into what it really meant.
Right.
And so, over the next, month and a half or so, it would be an opportunity for us to really, educate what we mean and then get additional input. And if there's still that feeling, then that will be something that you guys can discuss and make a recommendation, so.
So,
Yeah, okay.
this is not specifically related to this one, but maybe this is as good a place as any to talk about it. When we begin to move this out to the community, I'm interested. I've been kind of sitting here mulling over the challenge of this being 9 policies and however many strategies and a million action items, and how to get community engagement. Some of the stuff you actually have to kind of talk through it a little bit before you can really react to it. And I'd like to figure out if we could design, call it a community work session. And in my mind, what that means is you actually get 100 people together for 4 hours, and you divide them up amongst these policies. And you have a group of 6 or 8 or 9 people spend an hour talking about, basically having the same conversation we've just been having about what this is, what it means, what's good, what's bad, whatever. Do some report out to a larger group, maybe go through a couple of rotations so people get to do different policy areas. That may be completely unfeasible, and there may be no means of getting that done, or there may be no ability to get that many people engaged. But it really feels like getting that kind of a number of people that deeply engaged would be just incredibly useful compared to a chain of people talking for 3 minutes for a couple hours at a meeting. That would be much more useful to me, I know.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. I don't know, it's very costly too to get the staff that are needed to support that kind of a thing. But I think that we could think up a way to do something that similar. I think that's a great idea, and I know that there's a lot of people that are
We've got more people
galvanized,
engaged
so I
on-
think
we've-
this is a really great opportunity.
Yeah, we got more people engaged on these kinds of things now than we ever have before. We probably ever will again. And it seems like trying to find a way to capitalize on getting as much of that engagement harvested as possible would be really useful.
If you could do something similar, like a speed dating, where you break it into 3 groups, so you have 3 staff members, and the commissioners can be in there with it, and 3 groups, and you can do 3 policies per group, and then report back. That way, you're not doing 9 at it. You do
Well,
3.
and another idea I just had, and this is a work session and completely off the top of my head, I could use the planning commissioners too to help facilitate that.
Right.
Yeah.
That could be something. So let us talk about that and maybe talk back with you guys and our consultant team who
If we
will be
can
with
have-
us until the end of June,
Or
and discuss some options.
Or the stations, as they've had at other work sessions, where each station is manned by a person, and those 9 stations represent the 9 policies around the room.
Yeah, although I'm not interested in sort of a classic project open house where people just sort of wander around and ask questions. I'm really interested in actual small group discussions
Okay.
to really get a larger group getting the benefit of what we're having of actually talking this
A
stuff
group
through.
dynamic.
And group dynamic, exactly.
Okay.
And then reporting back to
Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
to say, okay, we understand this better now. This is what this all means.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a very positive way to go. I have nothing but support for that action. What I would caution you, however, is that you really need to set the framework for what you're doing as far as what the vision is, why you're doing the project. Because in isolation, there's always going to be people that look at a 4-story apartment building and will just not want it out of principle. It means more cars, it means more people, it means more
Sure.
neighbors, don't like it. But if you look at location, if you look at those people supporting your businesses, if you look at those people not driving because they can walk to work, then the conversation might start to shift. It might not, but those are the things you're looking at for a town center. It's not just we love density and we want more of it. It's like we want some of the things that come with it, like not expanding our growth boundaries so that we're all driving to the edge, or having more bodies supporting our businesses. So that's an unfacilitated conversation will really only solidify people's long-held beliefs, whereas a conversation around a theme, a topic, and a really narrow focus could help you get further along these lines. Again, it doesn't mean that doesn't open you up to other planning processes or shifting the focus of this one, but at least starting with this is what we were trying to achieve 12 months ago. This is where we're at now, and we need more people involved. Starting from there sounds like it's really necessary at this point.
Anything else on 4? Gene?
I think the action 11 reduce the minimum front yard setbacks. I'd like to know what's zoned neighborhood commercial to 0. I mean, that's a pretty,
There's
Neighborhood
only
com-
one piece of property along Sherwood Boulevard.
That's the Hyde House property, right?
and that's set all the way back to the back. So to me, that seems we're going to be creating an.
It's where
Odd
the
confusion.
community garden is.
I understand that,
Okay.
but I think you're creating I mean, you want one property that's there and that everybody else is set back. I think the action item itself is not. I think we need to remove or reword it. We don't need to move neighborhood commercial to 0 if there's only one piece of property. It's going to look weird. And then residential from 20 to 5 feet in the Old Town overlay. I think the Old Town overlay already takes into consideration closer to sidewalks already, doesn't it?
I don't think for the residential, but we can
Oh.
explore that.
And again, I think I go to Patrick's thing is it works maybe in some areas, but not in other areas. Some of those houses I don't, just the flavor of the neighborhood would change if you did a 5-foot setback.
So what I think I heard was you're not sure about exactly 4.1 and 4.3. You want to find out more why people are unsupportive and whether or not they might be more supportive if there's a more narrowed vision. So I from this I'm taking, go ahead and include these for notice purposes, but we're on alert that we might tweak these based on the input that we receive.
Tweaking all the way up to completely ditching them.
Yes.
You don't think they should be tweaked before we go to notice? To be a little bit.
Well, I mean, if there's a feasible way to narrow 4.3 at this stage, I'm just not. I can't suggest what that would be.
Yeah, because all we're going to do is listen to 3 hours of people coming up and telling us not to build 4 stories in Old Town. There are so many other battles.
This is town center, so it's every place.
So it's every place, but there's so many other battles in this document that we know this one's going to be, at best, very difficult.
Well, so this would go back to my point of where I'm beginning to wonder whether we shouldn't be pulling the Old Town area out of the town center plan and doing a separate amendment to the Old Town overlay, where we have a more refined talk about that, and then we're really talking about do we or do we not want 4-story buildings? Well, actually, we allow them already in the
Right, and I guess my concern about taking Old Town out of the town center plan is that we heard loud and clear that our town center is Old Town, and so I guess that would be concerning to say everybody who thinks that our town center is Old Town, it's not really, even though it's not currently.
Yeah, there's a how to talk about it and how
Yeah.
to do it and those kinds of things. But irrespective of that, I'm becoming concerned that the Old Town or that the town center plan is not a very elegant tool for making the kinds of changes that seem like they're prudent to make in the Old Town area.
So going back to Jean's suggestion of making 2 town centers,
Or yeah.
you know, we haven't even talked about central neighborhoods, but most of our focus has been on the Langer, you know, the commercial district, and then six corners and Old Town. You're making those 2 the town centers and handling them possibly different or the same in some cases, but allowing the ability to look at it that way. Can we have more than one town center? Can we connect them with?
No, not from a metro functional plan.
You don't-
And the
I don't
metro
think-
functional plan's purpose is to, you can't use, and I did listen. The 6 corners doesn't work for metro because it doesn't have any opportunity to redevelop your neighborhood into higher density, which is why they need that neighborhood, the central neighborhood. So they want 6 corners and the central neighborhood so that they can increase the density.
It's not exactly right, because you originally had your town center around 6 corners. That was the boundary without a plan. And certainly that was explored. You know, should we just try to use that boundary and come up with a plan for that boundary? So that was actually explored, and it had nothing to do with what the regional government wanted or not wanted. It just had everything to do with how much more would you have to do to make that into a truly mixed-use area. And I think that the steering committee or the stakeholder advisory committee thought that the barriers were a little too high. They weren't envisioning 6 corners as very town centery, if that makes sense, after having discussed attributes and things one might want to see at a town center. What was it? Oh, the notion of 2 town centers. Again, using a regional definition, you don't have enough people to have 2 town centers. You don't have a large enough geographic area, probably is more accurate. But that doesn't mean that you can't have 2 distinct overlays within your town center. And looking at the action items, that's really how they're kind of stacking up. There are quite a few that are all town only or everything outside of Old Town in the town center. So there are some already.
What if we had it allow and encourage buildings up to 4 stories within the Langer commercial district and limited or select or specific identified sites in the Old Town area, something like that, where we take the language
It's
and
more definable.
limit it. I don't know if it's definable, but it implies certainly that it's much more limited.
I actually wrote some language that I was hesitant to say because it's evaluating, but evaluate locations where up to 4 stories in Old Town could be feasible. So kind of getting at what you're saying, which is not every site may be suitable for that, but there might be sites that are, and so it's kind of a next step. It wasn't acknowledging the Langer commercial district, but 4 stories are already allowed in that commercial area. So.
Maybe instead of using feasible, using desirable
Ooh, yeah,
for the last thing.
that's a good idea. So my perspective would be modify it that way, put it up for notice, and people will still tell us they hate it, and we can, evaluate it at that point, but we haven't immediately foreclosed it yet.
Okay.
What do you think?
Work.
Gene's not sold.
How would you define
Desired.
who gets the benefit of 4 stories?
That would be
Which
a
property
future
owners?
planning process.
Yeah, you'd have to identify objective criteria that I would think would have to do with distance to other uses that you would somehow define as non-compatible with that, right? So classically, you wouldn't want to build 4 stories backing up to the other side of the street that are all single-family detached, right? That's what I would say.
And I would be hard pressed to find something in the Old Town area that doesn't have something abutting. Well,
The Robin Hood lot.
Robin Hood lot, and that one is right across the street from single family. The Fisher
Parts
Roofing.
of it are, yeah.
Yeah, so the objective where I saw you going with that is kind of understand the Fisher Lot because it's right up
Mm.
against the railroad tracks, but there still is a single-family residence.
Yeah, so in that case, the parts that are against the railroad tracks would be better than the parts that are up at the street front. And so you'd be able, a stair stepping kind of a thing with the railroad tracks being this center area that ends up, that's effectively a buffer. Seems like something that's worth exploring.
Can you build that into
The Old Town overlay.
the specifications or the considerations?
Yeah, you could do a distance definition of some kind. And again, I'm not saying I know that I'm advocating that's a good idea. I'm saying I think it's worth moving forward in the process and exploring further and getting more interaction on, rather than just pitching it out now.
Well, that's better than leaving it like this, certainly.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay.
You ready to move on?
Yeah,
to
let's move on to
5?
five.
Okay, the city will encourage property owners to invest in development that supports the town center vision and recommendations included in the town center action plan. Again, if we don't have the town center action plan as currently envisioned, we need to change that. This includes basically
All the popular stuff.
trying to get people to do the right thing, making it easier to do modifications, having catalyst projects. The action items that go with this are review the thresholds and criteria for major modifications to determine whether and how these could be modified to remove disincentives to redevelopment within the town center. And on this, I'm thinking, well, I guess that gets to the next one, which is the Old Town, making it easier for property owners in Old Town to do minor modifications. Action item 30 is exploring potential use of urban renewal funding for development or redevelopment of improvements on city-owned sites with a mix of uses appropriate to a town center environment. This is identified as a long-term. Obviously, that would require coordination with SURPAC and council, and there may or may not be things that are feasible, but that's kind of what is identified there as exploring that potential. And then 31 is similar, explore use of urban renewal or community development block grant funds to offset a portion of SDC fees in order to subsidize certain types of infill development within the town center. So again, trying to encourage people to do what we want them to do.
I would say SDC and other fees. Right? Site plan review or whatever.
Right, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because I mean, right now,
That's okay,
as was illustrated by the I forgot the name of the property that it was adding the deck or whatever it was
Right.
a couple of months ago. It was a lot of process and a lot of cost for not really anything very significant, and we couldn't do anything about it.
Right.
And so using alternative funding sources to pay those costs need to track to the cost of doing the work, and that's up to council and the city in terms of setting fees. But using those funding sources to pay those fees is a good way to get at that. Anything on here give anyone
Nope, not me.
palpitations?
Woohoo.
Let's move on to 6 of 9.
6 is the city supports transit service that serves the needs of the residences and businesses in the town center, including maintaining a robust local transit service network and planning for future high-capacity transit service to neighboring cities. There are actually no action items related to that because it's really just coordination and working with the outside agencies. Any comments
So
on
there
that?
was a fairly
Is there a
strong
question?
vein throughout the action items that were there, although there weren't any that were specifically attached to this, that were fairly anti-transit. And I couldn't suss out from there whether that was transit of any kind or if that was don't use this as a way to sneak in light rail or what exactly.
I think that's a quote.
In the survey responses,
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
'Cause
in the
there was no
comments.
question specifically for this one.
Right. But
But
there were places here and there.
Times where you read that, yeah.
And so I was left with a fairly big question in my mind of what does the community actually think about transit?
Mhm.
Or I should say, I'm fairly certain that there is an identifiable portion of the community that really is not in favor of transit of any kind. I don't know how big a how big a portion of the community that is.
And the term high-capacity transit to them means what, max, Wes?
Yeah, but even just regular plain old transit bus service or a TriMet bus service is not attractive to a portion of the community. I just don't know how big a portion that is.
That sentiment was kind of raised in question 4. I think is where that's kind of coming out.
And I guess the question is, is there something that you want us to really do to solicit that more specific input from the community? And do you have any concerns with any of the strategies that are identified?
Yeah, here's the comment. We get around just fine. Kids get around no buses and public. Yuck. I don't know if that means public transit or just we don't like the public or what that comment meant exactly.
Oh, we're not.
No max 2.
Yeah, we're not taking public comment tonight.
No
I
max.
appreciate that, though.
The main problem is
No max 2 or in Sherwood.
Yeah.
I don't want light rail or any more mass transit coming into Sherwood. And I think this is coming in the same time that the Southwest Corridor Transportation Plan was being done. So there was people hearing things that were part of that plan that were concerning to them about our community and thinking that this plan was somehow related to the corridor plan.
And it is related to the corridor plan because this plan is being coordinated with that. But just to be clear, the Southwest Corridor Plan, the current recommendation is not to have any high-capacity transit, bus rail or light rail. That was never on the table. To come to Sherwood, it would just be local transit service from Sherwood to Tualatin, as well as the existing local transit service from Sherwood to Tigard. So just for you as well as the public at home and in the audience.
So the Sherwood Corridor Plan that's a whole different track with a different group of people that's doing their own thing, and they've looked at Sherwood and said, you might get something to Tualatin, but other than that, your public transportation is not going to be changing in the near future. Maybe?
Sort of. Well, it wasn't a whole different group of people. We were at the table and part of the conversation, so it wasn't.
But we're not the decision makers as we are in this.
Well, so this whole thing goes to Darcy's point earlier that if I knew that substantial portions of the community really wanted better bus access to places either within or outside the community, then there'd be a conversation that I'd know how to have to say, if you want that, then you need to have more of this. And, the bunches of thises and that's, but it's a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if what I know is the community really doesn't give a rat's behind whether we have better bus service, then I know that I don't have anything to offer. I don't have any reason to pursue this and or that. And so this is an area where I think these are fine for public comment, but this is an area where I feel like I need to know a lot more about what the community really thinks about plain old rubber wheel bus transit, let alone anything higher, and in fact not let alone higher capacity, but as distinguished from higher capacity.
So does it mean making any of these more specific going forward, or are they pretty good as they're written?
In July, you'll have a better understanding of what the Southwest Corridor Plan is. We're voting in July on it. And so you'll get a copy of that and you'll understand more. And like you say, we are not the only ones involved in the table. So.
That'll be good to have right before our hearings.
The reason that Julie's really not bombarding with it now, there's 6 options. I think we're going to go to probably we'll find one.
Yeah, it's not really the final option. I mean, it kind of is, but it's the final option of this phase, which is, again, the recommendation is high-capacity transit from Portland to Tualatin via Tigard, but they're still exploring light rail or bus rapid transit, and they haven't identified a specific alignment. They've kind of have some ideas. So there's still additional phases that would be discussed. But one of the outcomes of the Southwest Corridor plan of this phase would be a TriMet working on a Southwest transit enhancement plan that would include providing those local connections to connect Sherwood to ultimately the high-capacity transit in Tualatin and Tigard. And I guess I would add, other than 6.2, I think all of these are kind of more citywide policies, not necessarily specific for the town center, but they're just, working with the agencies to talk about transit needs, long-term and short-term. 6.2 specifically talks about modes and locations to provide high-capacity transit service to the town center. And so that's something that we may want to talk more about once they make that final recommendation in July.
The other thing I would offer on this topic is the citizen volunteers on our committees did talk about transit quite a bit. So the folks that were involved with, was it the stakeholder group? I can't remember which one. Definitely wanted an enhanced transit service to Tualatin from Sherwood, wanted to protect and enhance the transit routes that come into town now. So at least there was a handful of people there with that opinion. I don't know how many comments you got in the surveys that oppose that, but there's certainly both viewpoints.
All right, let's move on to 7.
We're cruising now. Policy 7 is the city will implement transportation system improvements and standards that increase access between residences and civic, employment, and commercial uses within the town center boundary, and then improve safety for all modes of transportation for people traveling to and within the town center. And this has 4 action items. Action 4 is amending the TSP to adopt a cross-section design for Sherwood Boulevard and Langer Drive. So basically, so it would be different than other arterials and collectors in the city. Still consistent with safety and AASHTO and all that stuff, but just having different design standards. Action 5 is include the recommended transportation projects from the town center plan, and then lists specifically projects to include for bike and pedestrian activity or connections. Action 21 is through the TSP update, which we will be beginning within the next several months or so, evaluate mechanisms to provide increased flexibility for the design of arterials and collectors throughout the town center. And then 32 is evaluate where the sidewalk gaps within the town center. Evaluate where there are sidewalk gaps in the town center and prioritize locations. So that would be something that we'd evaluate, and then through the capital improvement plans, maybe do infill, sidewalk infill projects, or apply for grants to do sidewalk gaps.
I'm having a Shel Silverstein where the sidewalk ends. So I have questions. I have questions about 2 of them. I don't understand how 7.4 provide full pedestrian crossings at 99W fits with our definition of the boundary and our discussion of that as a hard edge.
They're taking my 6 corners plan.
I think the idea was that when we set the boundary at 99, there was the recognition that we wanted people to be able to get to the town center. It just wasn't as a narrowing, as much of that of that pedestrian activity. But Chris or Darcy, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, that's what the discussion was. Within the town center boundary itself, very convenient walking and biking routes, very safe routes, but not completely building a barrier and turning your back on everybody around. You have to be able to get to the town center. And right now there's a couple crossings of the highway that only have a crosswalk on one side of the intersection. And so it's just getting crosswalks on both sides.
Okay. And then 7.5 reads like, get the people who own property without sidewalks to put in sidewalks. Could it not also mean use city transportation utility fee dollars or TSP dollars or state revenue sharing dollars to fund sidewalks?
Potentially, yes. And I don't know about all the sources that you listed, but yeah, and especially if this is in a town center, it makes things more eligible for funding of that nature, and so you can maybe get some grant funds to have the, I'm not going to say the words right, but basically filling in sidewalk gaps, having the last mile and all that, those types of names for things. So Yeah, absolutely, it's more than just working with the property owners, and maybe.
Yeah,
we
so
need
I'd
to
be
make that more
interested in
clear.
seeing that broadened to, and not just look like we're going after the property owners.
Change the wording going forward. so that-
Identify other sources, or city or property owners.
Including
Right.
city assisted.
Right.
Well, we pay a tax on our water bill for
That's
sidewalks.
the transportation utility fee. Yeah. Yep. It's basically just what are the city's priorities for capital improvement and maintenance, and how would this fit into those?
Okay.
Other thoughts on 7,
Yeah.
Gene?
The road cross section, I would just like to have more information about. What I saw the picture of the street view was a non-standard street cutoff where it would be like no other roads in the city of Sherwood or most other driving communities. They would put. Did you see that view?
If I haven't, I'm not recalling it.
Is that the one with the median?
No, they put the bicycles riding to the right of the parked cars.
Oh no, I have seen that in a number of places.
And I just would like to have a little bit more information because I know that there's been a lot of conversations had in the city of Portland with their non-standard bike markings. And if we create non-standard bike markings, are we inviting?
Eugene has used that system for quite a while. Portland has got some of it now. I can think for sure along the far south end of Broadway, up in the Portland State area. And you're right. It takes some getting used to. Crossing from my car to one of the pay stations, didn't think about looking for 20-mile-an-hour bikes going by, and almost got.
Well, and you got pedestrians
Right.
who are opening onto sidewalks with no expectation that they're going to be
Right.
taken out. I just am expressing a concern that a non-standard
Right.
road in all of our city would be.
Fortunately, bike riders are even-tempered and accommodating.
Observant.
So, and that would be called cycle track is the terminology for that sort of configuration where you have a physical barrier, the parked cars, between the motor vehicle lanes and the bike lanes.
Sorry to interrupt, but the one step further is you've identified it on the 2 major thoroughfares that already have very wide sidewalks. So what's in front of the middle school, and I think anyway, that's just my concern is we're creating something non-standard in an area that people can already ride on the sidewalk.
And I think in front of the schools, the Sherwood Boulevard cross section was intended to be closer to Langer Farms Parkway. It's the off-street trail essentially where the bikes would be.
I can
Langer-
hardly hear you. What?
Sorry, on Sherwood Boulevard, along where the schools are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe we had on-street parking in the cross sections where the bikes were between on-street parking and the sidewalk. I think it was just like Langer Farms Parkway where there's a trail on one side that's wider than a sidewalk, and the bikes would be on that. So it's the same as what you already have in town. Langer Drive behind Albertsons and those properties was the one spot where we talked about doing that cycle track design.
But Langer Drive already had. Am I getting confused between Langer and Century Drive? Has the sidewalk already?
You're getting confused with Century.
That's it. Where's Langer Drive then?
That's
More or less. Well,
Isn't Langer Drive the one by
Altos and
Oh, the other side of
yeah,
that.
the other
Okay.
side of the apartments from Century.
Okay.
I was thinking parallel, and then
Yeah.
they ultimately become more or less parallel.
Got it.
at some point?
So it sounds like although there are issues in this area, it sounds like this wording for comment
Okay.
works.
Awesome.
So now, this one will be a little bit more interesting, but hopefully we can get through it. The city will balance the need for vehicular mobility within the town center with the other transportation and land use goals and priorities identified in the town center plan. And within the action items, and this is, there are a lot of tools that are in the toolbox that we were able to and asked to evaluate. We were asked to evaluate. And so that's kind of what this is attempting to do. Not to say any or all of them are what we want to move forward. And so I think that we very well may have some things that we want to talk more specifically about or not talk about anymore after this.
I know which tool you're building up to.
The first one is action item 3, which is the multimodal mixed use area. And Chris and Darcy, chime in if I'm getting this wrong, but essentially what this is a process that was allowed by the state after a lot of input from jurisdictions around the state, that basically said in certain areas you're going to have a lot of multimodal mixed uses, and we recognize that with that there's going to come some congestion, and in these areas if you meet certain standards you get a pass on the congestion. You still have to meet safety standards, but you get a pass on the congestion. And so again, this was adopted when we began this process, and we needed to explore that as an option. We're hearing a lot of feedback from a lot of people that that's maybe not something that we want to explore any further, but we have to at least have the conversation to say we talked about it. Chris or Darcy, do you have anything to add?
Well, just to add to that, the MMA designation is only for rezone land use applications. So it doesn't mean overall as a community or as the town center you would just not worry about congestion anymore. For any conforming use application that comes in, you still have your standards that apply. This is all about cities around the state that really struggled. The development community struggled, cities struggled to overcome the transportation planning requirements for rezones. I think downtown Tigard was one of the proponents of this, where they wanted to achieve a new vision for their downtown. They had to rezone to do that. And because of 99 right next to them that's at capacity right now, let alone 20 years in the future, they couldn't do it. And they basically said, enough with that, we want our vision. Congestion doesn't matter because it's already congested. But it's only for rezones. If you want to streamline rezone applications that come through, that's what the tool's for.
So that's action item 3. Action item 20 is related specifically to strategy 8.1, which is amending the development code to remove the capacity allocation program cap, which limits vehicular trips to no more than 43 p.m. peak trips per acre. And this is actually something that the city wants to discuss doing citywide, but certainly within the town center, if we want to encourage development and redevelopment within the town center, it's a hindrance. And examples specifically that I can cite, Dr. Doyle's project off of Hanley and 99, he had to reduce the size of his building because he didn't meet the cap. It's a very small site, very small lot, but because of the traffic and the uses, he had to reduce the size of his building. Ixtapa, same thing. That I don't know if it's called Ixtapa. The yellow Mexican building in front of Manzanillo. It came in as Ixtapa, so I still have that in my head. They had to reduce the size of their building because of they didn't meet the cap because of the trips. So there are specific examples within the town center where you're not necessarily getting the most efficient use of land. Actually, those are outside of the town center, where you're not getting the most efficient use of land, and not necessarily, you still have traffic studies and parking standards and all those other things that regulate what can happen. So that was discussed to remove that for the town center. I know Jean commented that it seems like at this point it's not necessarily fair to say that within the town center you don't have to comply with the cap, but then all these others do. And so that may be something that you guys want to talk about. It's certainly something that we're going to bring up when we do our transportation system plan coming up soon. And then action 22 is through the upcoming TSP update.
So can we back up?
Yeah.
So first off, the action items are going to be incorporated as part of this document, given any changes that we make through the rest of the process and the hearings, correct? Will they be incorporated as part of the document?
I guess that's a question for you, for the commission. My recommendation, it's really up to you. I was thinking that given that there's so many of the action items that need to be discussed in more detail, I think it may be confusing to have these action items adopted when we're not actually adopting code language. But that's something that I guess I'd want feedback from the
So-
commissioners.
I would suggest that we're going to have at least one more work session before we move to public hearing, right?
Mhm.
I would suggest we use that work session to talk about what's the presentation document that we want to put out there for the purposes of that discussion, whether or how it includes the action items and those kind of things.
Okay, whether the final document that,
Right.
or these are examples of.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I have concerns, but regardless, strategy 8.1 is twofold. It's a commitment we made to our citizens so many years ago when the Meineke intersection was done, and everybody up to this point has complied with it. If we're going to remove the cap, I believe we need to make a citywide comprehensive decision that is publicly noticed separately from this plan, because this plan is focused on a little narrow thing. That cap ordinance is all of the commercial property on 99 and 12th and Sherwood Road, and I think it's an inequitable situation if you remove it without notice.
You want to finish on 22 before we?
Yeah, 22
Oh,
is,
sorry.
that's okay. Through the upcoming TSP update, develop alternative mobility or other transportation performance standards that will apply within and along the edges of the town center. I'm sorry, Chris, can you talk a little bit about what that action item means?
That's the one I characterize as pretend the traffic isn't really as bad as it is.
I thought that was the MMA.
No, that was that one.
And this could take quite a few different forms. It could be in the town center, you are willing to accept more congestion than other parts of town. It could mean you start to have more complete street type performance measures, looking at the pedestrian bicycle environment and the performance of those in addition to motor vehicle performance, and making your land use decisions in the town center differently than you do in the rest of town. It could be more safety based. So there's a whole range of measures we can explore in the transportation system plan update.
So to Gene's point on the cap, I really agree with that notion of that's a separate decision that ought to be citywide. I find it just really fascinating that in application, the cap has prevented local businesses and yet wasn't, pardon the pun, a speed bump for the Walmart development. And I think that's just so sort of counterintuitive to what we might have thought. The whole topic to me is really frustrating in this respect. Yesterday, I happened to be looking at the traffic study related to the Graymore Walmart development, and if I remember right, the traffic PM peak hour traffic counts through the 99 W 12 and Sherwood Road intersection are about 5,000 vehicles, plus or minus a couple hundred, I think. And you know, the thing that's just inescapable to me is that 5,000 vehicles in an hour is not 1/3 of all of us driving through that intersection from 4 till 5 at night. That's mostly everybody around us. And so when we look at our own stuff, you know, we allow that gosh darned intersection and everybody in the world driving through it to basically control what art is or isn't in our community. On the other hand, you talk about building anything, and the traffic issue is at this point just an automatic freak out, even though you know, what you do or don't do in Sherwood has almost no effect on that intersection compared to everything else. And so I'm really frustrated with what's the right way to deal with that issue in this plan or really in anything.
And I would recommend, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all with either you or Jean. I think that it's important to put something in there about the cap in the town center to kind of help guide when we do the TSP update that this is an intent. And so maybe rather
Can we just broaden the language to keep it here but incorporate more than just the town center?
Yeah, or here's a suggestion I had, and again, I'm sorry, it's examine. Examine changes to the city's Oregon 99W capacity allocation program through the TSP update process or through the transportation system plan so that it doesn't restrict future growth that supports and implements, maybe just say development rather than implements the town center vision. Is that so that you're kind of putting that out there so that then when we do the TSB update, we could say, well, here's a policy that we want to at least carry forward to talk about through that process.
So this would provide a caveat in the TSP to remove the cap citywide, but not just, and at this point, it wouldn't remove it from anybody at all.
Right.
It would be a trigger for the TSP
When we do the
process.
TSP
Right.
to look at it citywide.
I
Look
would
at
be
it
more
or would do it.
Yeah.
I would be more comfortable using it as a trigger rather than a,
Go do.
yeah.
That's part of
Yeah.
this.
Okay. What about the other? So strategy 8.2, I guess the strategy 8.2 and 8.3, they kind of lead to the action items, but they don't have to lead to those action items. So I guess my question is, are you comfortable with the strategies, even if you're not comfortable with an MMA or alternate?
Yeah, I hate the
mobility
MMA.
standards?
Just to be really refined. 8.2 is one of those things where I get it, and I think it makes sense, and I know that if you woke up 100 residents of the city in the middle of the night and read that to them, 110 of them would hate it,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know what to do about that.
Are we wanting to increase congestion in the entire area? Or are we wanting to increase traffic in the Old Town area?
I don't think this says we're wanting to increase
says-
congestion.
While recognizing that some increase in congestion may be expected and appropriate.
Yeah, but I think what we're saying is we want to do some things while recognizing that we don't want to do all of the
can't do
things.
it.
We can't do everything that would be necessary for there to be no effect,
Okay.
which I think is different.
Some of the trade-offs that will come up in this work or the transportation system plan is, what do you want your community to feel like? We've come up with congestion issues for the cannery project and started to talk about mitigation measures like one-way streets in your old town to mitigate that. Does anybody want that? If you don't, do you change your standard or do you start denying development? You have those choices to make. So those are conditions where increased congestion may be okay because of the form that you want your roadways to take.
Well, when you put it that way.
I just get scared with something like this in there so that it just kind of means later when we come back, it's like, oh, that's what we wanted to do. That by just having it in our, as a strategy, it's like we're condoning that, okay, we are willing to accept
What if
increased
you-
congestion when people just have a real problem with that.
What about the first part of it, which is identify strategic road capacity improvement projects to address congestion within the town center?
That's
Is
okay.
that-
Right.
That's hard to argue with, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right, but I think what this was getting at, and really what the amendments to the transportation planning rule that Julia alluded to earlier is getting at, is you don't want to have to say no to the type of development you actually want. And again, that's still a topic of conversation within the town center of what exactly, how dense do you want to be and where do you want to be that dense. So that's still a question, but that's really what these strategies are getting at. If you're doing everything according to your plan and yet your transportation system, because of the mobility standards you have, won't allow you to actually build it, there's a disconnect. And we want to try to make sure that your transportation policies are in sync with your land use policies. I think identifying strategic road capacity improvement projects gives the impression that you're going to build your way out of congestion, which that might not be what you want to do. As Chris alluded to, you may not want to go to one-way streets. You may not want to build four-lane roadways through Old Town, et cetera.
Well, and the first part of the sentence is nothing more than what you do when you do a TSP, right?
Yeah.
The second part is what
Yeah. And
a developer will hang his hat on and say,
Right.
you expected me to increase your traffic, so here I am. That's
So
what it
so
is.
maybe we could recast this as being more explicit about a trade-off conversation, whether we decide we want trade-offs or not. Actually, consciously have that discussion as a part of the TSP update. Because right now, I think we don't explicitly have that. It's more the first half of the sentence, and prioritization and kind of stops there, as opposed to making sure that when we do the TSP, we then, in a more specific way than you can in this plan, say, are there places where we want to accept lower mobility or whatever in exchange for whatever we think we get?
So while recognizing that increased congestion will have to be analyzed as part of a vibrant town center and a transportation plan.
Something like that.
That would be better.
And as I'm looking at it now, strategy 8.3, looking at alternate mobility targets, that's really where you can get into that balance between congestion, safety, urban design. So if you took out that second part of 8.2 and just relied on strategy 8.3, I think you're still getting there.
That's
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm still kind of stumped that most of my neighbors will ask the question, why are you building anything at all without 12 and Sherwood being widened, or without 99 being widened, or without an overpass at the intersection, or whatever the investment would be to fix that, and that there isn't support for this notion of there being a trade-off for what we want. The issue would be we don't want anything as long as traffic is as bad as it is and getting worse. And I don't know how to get out of that box.
I just think that goes to your education component, that long dialogue that you do need about this particular issue. I mean, really, you are saying we want to keep the drive-throughs or these land uses, but what are those trade-offs? And it comes with a long dialogue of acknowledging that balance between congestion and vibrancy, and what that piece is and where you get there. I think that's what you want to hear from the people about. What's their limit?
when are we doing the TSP?
Bob, it's the IGA is at the state right now in review, so we should get it any time now, and then have it go to council for them to approve the IGA, and then we can begin the process. So
Okay.
it's fairly soon.
So it will be a transportation plan update prior to Walmart actually opening and us seeing the impact of that.
I don't know if it's going to be done by the time Walmart's completed. We're trying to get it within, 9 months, basically, of July. So wherever that puts
That
us.
seems to be a key component of what our future's going to look like. So I'd be scared to do the TSP before we
The
see.
trips would be anticipated in the TSP revisions. Those trips are already spoken for, by that Walmart development. So they will be included in our TSP update.
I understand the numbers on paper, but there's a reality. I mean, when the rubber hits the road figuratively and literally is when the residents of Sherwood will know that the transportation planners got the numbers right. But anyway, that's for a different
More
discussion.
importantly, when the numbers are, even if the numbers are correct, they will be more than they will want, because their threshold is lower than what the actual allowed amount is. We already know that. So there's no winning that.
All right, so with some modification to
We're fine with that.
8.2, are we
Yeah.
good enough to go on that? Let's move on. 9 is the last one, right?
Yes.
9 at 9.
The city will support actions that provide sufficient parking for businesses and residences while maximizing the efficiency of parking areas. The action items that specifically relate to that, and again, I guess we'll get to this in a minute, but I want to stress again that the action items are not necessarily the exact route to get the strategies implemented. But 7 is establishing townhome parking requirements consistent with multifamily or single family. So it's really calibrating the parking. We have different parking standards for townhome that aren't consistent with what you would have to do for a single family or multifamily.
Isn't part of the problem with our townhome parking standard that our townhomes are all front loaded rather than alley loaded, and so you've not only got the complication of whatever the parking standard is, but driveways mean there's virtually no street parking in areas that are townhome developed. Put differently, if you had alley loaded
Right.
townhome parking, you'd be able to have a different
Right.
standard because you'd have much more street parking.
Yes, yes.
So does this envision looking at that issue?
It could.
Seems
So
reasonable.
alleys.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
So the townhome standards say that depending on whether or not you're in MDRH or the HDR zones. So MDRH, you're supposed to have 2.5 spaces per unit, and then in the HDR, you're only required to have 2. Well, what this standard would do would put it back to what the multifamily standards are, which ranges from 1 to 1.75, depending on the number of bedrooms in the unit. I would argue that the combination of moving the products to the front of the street would force people who develop townhomes to put the parking behind the street, in an alley-loaded situation. And we do allow parking within the townhome standards to count towards, garage parking in the townhome standards to count towards the minimum parking requirements, whereas we don't do that in the multifamily standards.
But when that standard went to council, and this may go back before anybody who's here was around,
You are
except
old.
Gene, maybe. Thank you. Didn't the council mess with that standard, with the parking standard particularly based, the notion that no one will actually park their cars in their garages?
I don't remember
It's
where
true
it
in my
got-
neighborhood, let alone in.
Yeah,
townhomes.
I don't remember when or where it got tweaked, but
It's a storage unit.
so do the townhouse standards count garages as parking spaces or not?
Yes.
So if you have a townhouse and you have a garage, you have 1 parking space already.
Correct, and
And you
then
have
if you have a
2.5.
20-foot driveway in front of that garage, you have a second parking space.
And so you're proposing that you remove the garage as a parking spot?
No, I think the reduction is actually overall, so like 2.5 spaces in the HDR zone, depending on the number of, you could ultimately end up with a odd digit that we'd have to round up or round down.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do that again with the multifamily standards, but this reduces the amount of parking that would necessarily be required with a townhome, because generally, I guess it's assumed that people that live in townhomes will not need as much parking as somebody that lives in a single-family residence. I'm not entirely sure that's where the standard comes from, but I believe in a lot of the literature that I've read, that's kind of that townhomes tend to be associated with more transit around areas that are transit supportive. That may not be the case, but Sherwood does allow the garage to count towards the parking.
I'm okay with that part.
Well, the verb here is reevaluate, right? So
Yeah.
that's fairly soft.
Yeah, I just see, based on previous experience with a lot of people complaining that there's never enough parking around multifamily, I don't want to make
Yeah.
That
parking
was
less.
worse. Yes.
Mhm.
Without
Yeah, and-
without concrete information that says this townhouse development in Sherwood, built to our standards, has so many empty spaces around it that we are wasting space.
Right.
And if we can see that, then I could say, oh yeah, now I can see our code needs to be tweaked. But I have not ever heard anybody at any planning commission meeting tell us that they have too much parking in their area.
The townhomes
Well,
are
yes.
rough.
Well,
That's
except,
right.
except in
Handling,
big
right?
parking lots, like
No, even they won't.
No one.
If you look,
Visitors.
if a merchant has, Old Town is reduced to entirely parking lots and one business, there'll still be a need for more parking.
Yeah.
You're never going to hear, we have too much parking. That's just
Right.
not the nature of the beast.
The-
Which is why I really like 9.5, which is actually monitoring supply and demand for on-street and off-street parking, because that would give us actual data, which we
Okay.
have relatively little of.
we need a. Where does it say parking study?
That's one of the action items.
Yeah.
And that's action
And we do have one now.
33.
We
Determine
do
the
have one
potential
now.
scope of a future parking study, including the geographic extent of such a study within the town center, and seek funding for a planning process. And that is,
33. 33.
let's just say, it's not related to any specific strategy, but it's related to that policy. And then also, action 34 is related, I think, to 9.2, which is within the town center, allow a reduction of 5% of required parking for commercial uses that meet certain site design criteria,
Such as.
up to a maximum reduction of 15%. And it's got a list of things that are, pedestrian and bicycle and transit friendly and supportive uses.
Well, and so, I mean, I guess implicit, maybe not implicit. Right now in Old Town, we don't have a parking standard.
Right.
Part of why I was historically resistant to there being a parking standard was because we didn't have a parking study to give us any data about demand and supply and demand of parking. We now have a snapshot from 6 or 8 months ago or whenever that was done. But nothing here actually then says, go figure out, do we need a parking standard and what would it be? Doesn't that seem like it seems like that ought to be here.
It's a good suggestion.
Right now, there's none in Old Town at all?
Right.
No.
No requirements?
Right.
There's no requirements on the Smockville.
In the Smockville portion, right.
Cannery has to provide 65% of what's required in 16.94.
Yeah, so the general notion was that the lenders on commercial development would be the ones who would require parking because they wouldn't on a large like residential development, which has been the case. Those have parking incorporated into the building. That's actually changing a little bit in the credit markets. And then redevelopment, particularly the church down across from the park, has raised a lot of issues about whether it does or doesn't have adequate parking. And yet I think our parking study showed we have 2 or 3 parking spots for every car that's actually
Within Old Town.
within the
that study
Smockville,
area, it
the
was
Smockville.
35%
Right.
capacity.
Right.
But we're wanting it to improve more, to get more.
Right.
So-
Yeah, so at some point, some planning commission is going to need to decide what's the right ratio that we want to have, and if you want that ratio, then at what point will development tip you over that, and then what standard you need to have that development. That's a whole. I think that's a whole strategy that needs to be incorporated.
I would agree with that.
Anything on this list give anybody the itches? At least for purposes of putting it out to the public.
Well, I think they're not gonna like it because they don't want to lose the parking, so it'll be one of those knee-jerk reactions unless we're a little more specific, maybe.
Like.
Put the park, when we talk about the parking study, should we put that in strategy 9.5?
I would make
Reference.
I would make that the new 9.1, so it's at the top of the list myself.
Yeah, and
Use
I wasn't going to
parking.
number it that way, but I certainly made a note to add a strategy to examine whether a parking standard is needed in Old Town.
So I personally think 9.3, 9.4, 9.5 are pretty non-controversial pieces. It's really 9.2 especially.
And maybe that's something that we can have more of a conversation on, because
There's really 2 vastly different sets of issues at the Langer area and in Old Town, right? Because in
Yeah.
the Langer area, we today have hugely underutilized parking areas.
and in Old Town, you have no parking standards. So,
Right.
So I think making it clear that this is applying to the Langer area would be more clear. But also, our code already allows some flexibility and maybe a little bit more discussion on kind of what the standards are and what you could do under current standards without that. And maybe we need to reevaluate that and say maybe all these the flexibility that we already have in the code should be morphed into something that really is a little bit more, getting credit for things that are pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly and that kind of thing. And so maybe that's something that we want to talk a little bit more about as we move forward. Do you think that the strategy should change to reflect that we need to talk more about that?
Yeah, it probably needs to be clearer about what the nature of the choices or discussion are.
Okay. So we'll need to talk more about this.
Yeah.
I think so.
So I'm going to move to the next slide.
Okay.
Because I think we're there. So what I was hoping to get, I think we got some wonderful feedback tonight on the plans and policies. I think that we got enough input to allow us to prepare the notice with the understanding that changes are still very possible and likely. What happened? Based on the feedback of the public hearings and discussion. I think that we do need to have additional work session before we get into the public hearing, and so I don't know what work, we could certainly do it in 2 weeks if you would like, or we could do it in July. We anticipate having the first hearing at the Planning Commission level in August. Mr. Allen, do you have anything? I know that you're.
I think July would be great.
Yeah.
We can't have it next week,
What?
Oh.
It's okay.
so Patrick can have the fun.
Is next week time enough to?
No, that's the
Well, not
council
next. The
meeting.
next
No,
planning
to 2
commission
weeks.
meeting is. Well, it certainly would be better from a budget standpoint. I don't know whether or not it would be better from a time standpoint.
Budget, we would meet.
Do we have anything else on the agenda in 2 weeks?
We do not have anything on the agenda in 2 weeks.
It's really up to you guys, I think.
What's the date?
That would be
25th.
the 25th.
Well, why don't we tentatively plan on that, and we'll talk tomorrow and regroup, and then we'll let you guys know and let the public know via the website.
This be another work session like this.
It would be another work session that would be posted, and we'll make sure that we get the word out.
Well, maybe the best utilization of time is to take this information and maybe you can take a look at it, but it seems like you want to hear more from what the public thinks. So we could focus our efforts on getting together whatever type of open house or not an open house, but whatever feedback that we're going to try to circulate through the month of July.
Yeah, so at the meeting on the 25th, we would talk about what would that look like, what would the circulation document look like, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And then we could craft any,
That could be ready.
from the changes that you give us, we can craft any further wordsmithing for that.
Of the policy.
So, big question, are we all sold that the town center is only as presented to us? Or,
I'm not sold on that, but I don't think we need to change it for the notice purpose.
and I don't
That
know,
would be a big discussion for next week then, I think.
Julia, do we need to change the notice if we are considering to change the town center area
I
to be?
was definitely thinking that, based on the feedback this evening, I think that when we do the mailed notice, I think that we'll probably do a mail notice to everybody within the area, and I think we'll do the whole study area.
The whole study area, yeah.
DLCD, I think we'll say this is the plan. They know that things can change, and we'll maybe highlight that there's still discussion on the boundary.
So would it be study area plus 1,000 feet, or how would that work? Or does the
That would be the whole
does
city.
the 1,000 foot enter into this?
Let me check. It's legislative, so it's kind of questionable whether or not you actually have to.
If I were lived in the residential areas next to
Yeah.
Safeway, I'd want to know. Right?
Yeah,
Sold on
probably.
Okay.
going across 99?
No. It should go across
So, and I wanted to, before we leave, discuss a little bit more about the action plan, and Jean brought it up again, about whether or not the action plan would be adopted along with it. Certainly, originally, that was the plan, and the intent was that we would, have this town center plan and the adoption package, and have the adoption package elements that, including code amendments and things like that, adopted with the action plan and the longer term steps identified. I'm concerned that, again, the details in the action plan don't necessarily reflect what we will decide to do, and I don't want that to trip up the whole process. And so my proposal is to move forward with the town center plan and the policies and strategies. If we have the action plan, maybe we caveat, a lot that says, here's examples of how that might be implemented, and that maybe we could do if that's something you guys feel comfortable with. But I want to make sure that it doesn't get derailed because people don't like the words in the action plan when we know that we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail when we actually come forward to actually implement.
If what we mean by that is we're gonna ultimately adopt policies and goals that are 100% complete, but we'll have attached to it an action plan that's 70% complete, and we're going to go do the other. We're going to do the other 30%, finish the other 30%, whether that's in terms of changes or new stuff or deletions or whatever. That might make some sense, but it seems like we ought to be able to talk about the 70% in the context of the other, of the policies and goals, right?
That's where she's talking about using examples on the ones that are straight, that we're very clear we were all in agreement on.
If that's what we mean by examples, then yeah.
But
I'm
there's
really worried about the idea of adopting goals and policies, or policies and strategies, and sort of
being too
making
vague.
it seem like actions are a blank slate, right?
If I could just add, and again, I'm not sure this is clarifying anything, but I'm going to try to at least let you know how we put together the document. The policy direction section really was intended to mirror what's in your comprehensive plan and be at that level of detail. In your comprehensive plan, you don't have such a detailed action plan that actually identifies how you would address your strategies. But we went a step further in this process, and it was always intended that we would possibly get to some modifications to your code. So we really did need to get that specificity, get some feedback so we could actually provide you some draft language possibly. If you don't get that far in this process in the near term, there's nothing to say that you have to toss out the ideas that were in your original action plan, or you can modify that. But it really is an appendix to your plan. It's like the other appendices. It's background information. It's work that went into the plan. It's illuminating if people want to go through it to see where you started to how you ended up. But it doesn't obligate the city the way your comprehensive plan does. Your comprehensive plan is as you know, that's your policy document. When you have someone come in for a comprehensive plan amendment, a change to their land use designation, they're going to have to go to these policies. And that's really the level that the policy direction was intended to be. It is vague but the same way that other comprehensive plan policies, again, just articulate what the city wants, not particularly how it's going to get there. So how you get there and how you present to people how you might step through your action items or your implementation plan, that I guess is something that needs to be kind of figured out, for your next work session.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't worry that the action plan itself, as an appendix to your town center plan, obligates you to do anything. And I've seen transportation system plans that have appendices that have specific code language that never was adopted.
Yeah, no,
so-
in principle, I totally understand and agree with what you're saying. I think given where we are right now in the wake of the Graymore Walmart development,
And
that
Southeast.
degree of trust us, we'll get to the details later, just won't fly. And we probably can't get to 100% complete, but we got to to be able to get the policies and strategies to fly. We've got to be able to say something intelligible and that's a commitment in terms of how we're going to get there. I just think that's where the community is right now.
And that's
there's so much detail in your action plan, and even that's why it was implementation versus short term versus long term, because the long term ones are harder. They have less. They're more. They entail more.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again,
and my concern, I'm sorry, my concern is the same as yours, sort of in the wake of this trust us, that people are going to think that we're saying without any public input really in depth that this is what we want. And I think there's a lot of these action plan items that we've gotten input that are concerning, and we need to have a very detailed public outreach. And so my concern is putting it out there may lead people to think that this is what we're proposing to do, when in fact all we're saying is that we want to have a conversation in more detail, and here's an idea, but we're not sure that this is the end.
So really, for next time's session of how are we going to communicate this stuff and how are we going to gather
next
input.
time.
Okay.
So just to be clear in terms of what's going to happen next now, everyone is comfortable, I'm looking and asking, with this set of policies and strategies as we've massaged them over the last 3.5 hours, and with lots of reference to lots of them being places where there are more questions than answers, being the document that gets noticed to Department of Land Conservation and Development, so that the clock starts for the 35-day waiting period to allow us to begin to have public hearings. That doesn't mean on the 35th day we have public hearings. We've got at least one more work session we've already put on the calendar, and we could conceivably do more if we wanted to go that direction. But that we're comfortable with staff going ahead and starting that clock running so we can move the process to the next step. Is that fair?
If we don't move it, if we wait 2 weeks to do that decision, that moves us out 2 weeks for the 35 days. Is that a big problem?
No. We actually, I think, have until early July to do the notice for the August meeting. The July 9th is what I said. So we certainly can wait.
I don't know
again,
what changes we come up with, but are we just talking, if the action items won't be included in what we're talking about, or they will be?
What's that?
What you're putting forward is just the strategies and the policies, not the action item? Is that right?
What will go to DLCD as part of the notice?
Not the action items.
Okay.
That's my proposal, because I don't, I think that those are informational, not,
Okay.
we're not adopting them as text. We're not proposing to, again, I need your feedback on that. If I'm going in a direction that you guys don't agree with, if you think we're ready for text amendments.
Yeah, I
Then
think that's
let's-
next week's discussion, but I don't think we're ready for text amendments.
I don't either. And, again, like I think I said at the Joint Planning Commission Council work session, it is really common for jurisdictions to break complex projects like this up into sort of the adoption of the plan and then the implementation of the plan. It's not the way we've done things in the past, and it's not necessarily ideal, but it allows you to kind of deal with the issues and then deal in more depth. And so, but I do hear what you're saying about making sure that the action plan sort of parameters are available for the public to understand what these things mean. I just really don't want people to think that means that we're circumventing that more public conversation.
So do we want to wait 2 weeks or go ahead and let them notice now?
Is
This is a big bug. Sorry.
You realize that when people watch this on TV, no one can see the bug, right? Gene?
the notice to DLCD, is that also what's noticed to the public? Because at our next work session, I mean, there are,
Too many things.
the comment about, are we comfortable with the policies and strategies? I'm comfortable we had a conversation with them. There are a couple strategies I'd like to throw out.
Right.
And there's a couple of policies that I'd like to have recrafted. So if we send it to DLCD and then next week we say, you know what, we just can't abide by policy 2, it needs to go away completely, will that impact our ability to proceed? Or would it be
No.
better just to wait till we find out if there's any significant changes?
I mean, we certainly can wait. That's not
Okay.
I don't think gonna hurt. I can check with, obviously the closer we get to the end of June, the less we have their time to help us with things. But I think that we could certainly wait. One thing I was thinking too is that even if we do go ahead and do the DLCD notice, I'm thinking it would be great if we don't normally do this, but maybe we'll bring the proposed public notice to you guys and let you see what it says and see if you have any thoughts on that. Would you
I'd
be-
like
That's a good idea.
I'd
like
really
that.
like to see the public notice. I
Yeah.
mentioned to Julia before the meeting that I had seen, I don't know how many different postcards from the city telling me about the town center designation for the past year, and I did not get engaged in the process because it was written in a language that was not as understandable to my layman terms about what was going to be potentially impacted by the decisions made at the planning commission. And so if we could
It's
get
really scary.
7
Read it.
laymen's looking at it and saying, a couple tweaks here might get more people engaged to understand would be really
That's a good idea.
great.
All right, so it sounds like we're going to see what the notice is going to look like in 2 weeks. We'll wait those 2 weeks before the notice goes to DLCD. That'll start the 35-day clock before we can have public
Right.
hearings.
That's not to say we can't solicit public input.
Right, so we could do that public workshop or whatever we might want to try to do. We can still do so.
Right.
But so from a process standpoint, we'll have at least one more work session on this, probably more, depending on what we're able to come up with in terms of that public engagement piece. Notice will go out. We'll have one or more public hearings on the plan here at the Planning Commission, and that's public testimony in the whole 9 yards. We'll ultimately make a recommendation to the council, and they'll have one or more public hearings on the topic, again, with public testimony in the whole 9 yards, before any action's taken. So hopefully there's lots and lots of opportunity for engagement between now and the time anything, if anything, happens. Is that everyone track? Anything else tonight?
I think that's it. Did you guys have anything?
All right, in that case, we'll call the work session adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.